Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the life of Wulfhere of Mercia, the first Christian king to wield true dominance across much of southern England. Son of the legendary pagan warrior Penda, Wulfhere transformed from a hidden prince into the most powerful ruler of his age, blending ancient warrior traditions with the emerging Christian faith. This complete journey will softly guide you through his remarkable rise from political exile to Christian overlord, his diplomatic triumphs and military campaigns, and his lasting legacy as the king who unified southern England under Mercian rule. From the misty battlefields of 7th century Britain to the peaceful monastery halls where monks copied sacred texts, we'll explore every gentle moment of this extraordinary reign. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. It truly helps other sleepy souls discover these historical tales. And don't be shy about leaving a gentle comment, sharing which part of Wulfhere's story intrigued you most, or perhaps tell us about your favorite medieval king or queen. Your thoughts always bring such warmth to our little community of history lovers. Of course, subscribing keeps these soothing historical journeys coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from 7th century England lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Wulfhere, later known as King Wulfhere of Mercia, entered this world around the year 640, during one of the most turbulent periods in Anglo-Saxon England. Born into royalty, yet destined to spend his youth as a fugitive, he emerged from the shadows to become the most influential Christian ruler of his generation, transforming not just his own kingdom, but the very nature of English kingship itself. The child, who would one day be called the first Christian king of all Mercia, drew his first breath in the heart of Middle England, in the ancient royal seat of Tamworth. This was a land of rolling hills and dense forests, where the River Trent wound its way through fertile valleys, and where the smoke from countless hearth fires rose into the grey autumn sky. The Mercian heartland stretched from the Welsh borders in the west to the fenlands of East Anglia, encompassing what we now know as the English Midlands, a region that would become the foundation of his future empire. His father, Penda, was already a legend by the time young Wulfhere could walk, known throughout Anglo-Saxon England as the last great pagan king. Penda commanded respect and fear in equal measure. He was a man of immense physical presence, towering above his warriors, his voice carrying the authority of one who had never known defeat in personal combat. Penda's reign had begun around 626, and for nearly 3 decades, he had transformed Mercia from a collection of minor tribes into one of the most formidable kingdoms in all of Britain. The Queen Mother, Sinuais, provided a gentler influence in young Wulfhere's early years. She was a woman of noble bearing and quiet intelligence, possessed of the diplomatic skills that would later emerge so prominently in her son. While Penda conquered through strength of arms, Sinuais understood the subtler arts of alliance building and political maneuvering. From her, Wulfhere inherited his capacity for patience and his instinctive understanding of when words might prove more powerful than swords. The royal household at Tamworth in those days was a bustling centre of activity. The great hall, constructed of massive oak timbers and roofed with thick thatch, dominated the hilltop settlement. Here, warriors gathered each evening to share mead and stories of battle, their voices rising and falling with the flickering flames of the central hearth. Young Wulfhere would sit in the shadows, absorbing the rhythms of power and politics, learning to read the subtle expressions that crossed men's faces when they spoke of loyalty and betrayal. Wulfhere was not the only royal child growing up within those timber walls. His older brother Penda, destined to rule briefly before his tragic end, showed early promise as a warrior and diplomat. There was also Ethelred, younger than Wulfhere, but possessed of a deeply contemplative nature that would later lead him to embrace the religious life with extraordinary devotion. The royal sisters, Cinnaber and Cyniswith, brought grace and learning to the court, their marriages eventually creating vital alliances that would serve Mercian interests for generations to come. Perhaps most mysterious of all the royal children was Merewal, who may have been Wulfhere's half-brother. This shadowy figure would later become king of the Magonsate, ruling the border regions between Mercia proper and the Welsh kingdoms. Merewal's exact parentage remains unclear to this day, but his influence on Wulfhere's later policies suggests a relationship of both trust and mutual benefit that went far beyond mere political alliance. The education of a Mercian prince in the 640s encompassed far more than simple literacy or religious instruction. Wulfhere learned to handle weapons from the moment he could lift a wooden sword, practicing daily under the watchful eyes of his father's most experienced warriors. He mastered the art of horsemanship on the hardy ponies that roamed the Mercian countryside, developing the seat and balance that would later serve him well in countless military campaigns. But warfare was only one element of his training. Penda, despite his reputation as a fierce pagan, understood that successful kingship required intelligence as well as strength. The young prince learned to speak the Celtic languages of their Welsh allies, mastering the complex courtly protocols that governed relations between kingdoms. He studied the ancient laws and customs of the Angles, memorizing the genealogies that legitimized royal authority and the precedents that guided judicial decisions. The religious landscape of young Wulfhere's world was complex and rapidly changing. His father remained stubbornly loyal to the old gods, Woden the All-Father, Thuna the Thunderbearer, and Tu the Warbringer. The great festivals of the pagan year still marked the rhythm of court life. The winter solstice celebrations that lasted for 12 days, the spring rituals that ensured the fertility of crops and cattle, the harvest ceremonies that gave thanks for another year's survival. Yet even in Penda's proudly pagan kingdom, the influence of Christianity was growing stronger with each passing year. Missionaries from Ireland and Northumbria moved freely through Mercian territory, and Penda, despite his personal beliefs, had adopted a policy of religious tolerance that allowed them to preach and even establish small communities of converts. This pragmatic approach reflected his understanding that the future belonged increasingly to Christian kingdoms, and that complete isolation from this trend would ultimately prove self-defeating. Young Wulfhere observed these developments with the sharp intelligence that would later characterize his own religious policies. He watched Christian merchants arrive at Tamworth's trading posts, noting how their faith seemed to provide them with networks of trust and mutual support that extended far beyond tribal boundaries. He listened to the stories of Christian miracles and marvels that filtered back from distant kingdoms, recognizing the powerful emotional appeal of a religion that promised eternal life to the faithful. The boy also witnessed the gradual transformation taking place within his own extended family. His brother Peada's conversion to Christianity, undertaken partly for political reasons, but growing into genuine faith, provided a close-up view of how the new religion might complement rather than replace traditional Mercian values. The sight of his brother maintaining his warrior's honor while embracing Christian mercy suggested possibilities that the traditional pagan framework seemed unable to accommodate. As Wulfhere entered his teenage years, the political situation throughout Anglo-Saxon England was becoming increasingly unstable. To the north, the Kingdom of Northumbria, under King Oswiu, was expanding its influence southward, challenging Mercian hegemony in ways that would soon lead to open conflict. To the south and east, smaller kingdoms like Wessex, Kent, and Essex maintained a precarious independence, playing larger powers against each other in an effort to preserve their autonomy. The young prince accompanied his father on numerous diplomatic missions during these years, learning firsthand the delicate art of negotiation and the careful calculation of risk that characterized successful statecraft. He watched Penda forge alliances with Welsh kingdoms, understanding how shared enemies could create temporary friendships between peoples who had been raiding each other for generations. He observed the complex marriage negotiations that bound royal houses together, recognizing how the personal relationships between rulers could shape the destiny of entire peoples. These experiences were preparing Wulfhere for leadership in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. Every feast he attended, every council meeting he observed, every military review he witnessed was adding layers to his understanding of power and its proper exercise. He was learning to read the subtle signs that indicated a nobleman's true loyalty, to distinguish between genuine support and mere expedient compliance, to recognize the difference between temporary setbacks and fundamental threats to royal authority. The countryside around Tamworth in those days bore little resemblance to the England we know today. Vast forests of oak and ash stretched to every horizon, broken only by the occasional clearing where small farming communities scratched out their precarious existence. Rivers ran cleaner and fuller, their waters teeming with fish and supporting flocks of water birds that have long since vanished from the English landscape. Wolves still prowled the deeper woodlands, and the great auroch, wild cattle as large as modern bulls, roamed in herds through the more remote valleys. This was a world where the boundary between the natural and supernatural remained fluid and permeable. Every grove had its guardian spirit, every stream its presiding nymph, every hill its ancestral ghost. The old gods were not merely objects of worship, but active participants in daily life, their influence visible in every storm, every drought, every unusually abundant harvest. For a young prince growing up in such an environment, the transition to Christianity would require not just a change of belief, but a fundamental reorientation of his entire worldview. Yet even as Wulfhere absorbed the traditional culture of his ancestors, he was also developing the intellectual flexibility that would later enable him to embrace new ideas with remarkable success. His natural curiosity led him to question established assumptions, to explore alternative approaches to persistent problems, to imagine possibilities that lay beyond the conventional wisdom of his time. These qualities, nurtured by the complex political environment of 7th century Mercia, would prove essential to his eventual success as a Christian king ruling over a kingdom in the midst of religious transformation. The year 654 brought the first serious clouds to gather on Wulfhere's horizon. His father's long-standing rivalry with Northumbria was approaching a crisis that would test every aspect of Penda's political and military skill. The young prince, now approximately 14 years old, found himself increasingly drawn into discussions of strategy and alliance building as the kingdom prepared for what, many suspected, would be a final confrontation with Oswu's growing power. As autumn turned to winter, and winter gave way to the fateful spring of 655, Wulfhere could not have imagined that within months his entire world would collapse around him, forcing him into hiding and exile from which he would emerge as a very different person, one destined to reshape not just Mercia, but all of southern England according to a vision that brilliantly combined the best of the old ways with the transformative power of the new Christian faith. The year 655 brought darkness to the kingdom of Mercia, as King Penda prepared for what would become his final campaign. The great pagan warrior king, now approaching his 70th year, had spent months assembling the largest army in living memory, a vast coalition that stretched from the Welsh mountains to the East Anglian marshlands. Yet for all his careful planning and mighty alliances, Penda could not have foreseen that this campaign would end not in triumph, but in catastrophe, forever altering the destiny of his youngest son and the kingdom they both loved. The crisis had been building for years, as Northumbria, under King Oswiu, steadily expanded its influence southward. Oswiu, the brother of the sainted Oswald, whom Penda had killed at Maserfield 13 years earlier, had never forgotten or forgiven that defeat. He had spent more than a decade methodically building alliances, strengthening his military forces, and waiting for the perfect moment to avenge his brother's death and secure Northumbrian dominance over all of Britain. Young Wulfhere, now 15 years old and standing on the threshold of manhood, watched with growing anxiety as his father's court transformed into a bustling military headquarters. The great hall at Tamworth echoed with the constant tramp of armed men, the ring of weapons being sharpened, and the urgent voices of messengers arriving from every corner of the kingdom. Sleep became elusive for the young prince as he lay awake listening to the sounds of preparation and wondering what role he might play in the coming conflict. Penda's strategy for the campaign reflected both his military genius and his understanding of the complex web of alliances that characterized Anglo-Saxon politics. Rather than relying solely on Mercian forces, he had spent months negotiating with traditional enemies to create a grand coalition united by their shared fear of Northumbrian expansion. From the Welsh kingdoms came Cadafel ap Cynfeddw of Gwynedd, bringing with him seasoned warriors accustomed to fighting in the hill country that bordered Mercia's western frontier. The East Anglians, under their king Ethelhere, provided another crucial component of Penda's alliance. These were descendants of the same people who had produced the magnificent treasures later discovered at Sutton Hoo, and their warriors carried weapons and armour that reflected both their wealth and their skill in battle. Their participation in Penda's coalition represented a significant diplomatic triumph, binding together kingdoms that had often found themselves at odds over territorial disputes and trading rights. Even more surprising was the participation of elements from Deira, the southern portion of the Northumbrian kingdom itself. King Ethelwald, who ruled this region as Oswiu's subordinate, had grown increasingly resentful of his overlord's domination and saw in Penda's campaign an opportunity to assert greater independence. His decision to support the Mercian coalition, however secretly, demonstrated the fragility of Oswiu's position and the widespread nature of the opposition he faced. As the great army assembled during the summer of 655, contemporary observers estimated its size at 30 legions, a massive force by the standards of the time, perhaps numbering close to 20,000 warriors. The sight of so many armed men gathered in one place must have been both inspiring and terrifying, representing the largest military effort undertaken in Britain since the Roman legions had departed 2 centuries earlier. Wulfhere accompanied his father and the army during the early stages of the campaign, riding alongside the royal household guards and observing firsthand the complex logistics required to move and supply such a massive force. He watched the careful coordination required to ensure that Welsh cavalry, East Anglian infantry, and Mercian warriors could operate effectively together, despite their different languages, customs, and fighting techniques. The young prince also witnessed the religious ceremonies that preceded the army's departure. Penda, true to his pagan beliefs, sacrificed white horses to Woden and poured mead on the ground to honour the war god Tiw. Yet he also permitted Christian prayers among those of his allies who followed the new faith, demonstrating once again the pragmatic tolerance that had characterized his approach to religious matters throughout his reign. The march north proceeded smoothly during the late summer months. The coalition forces moved through the Mercian heartland, crossed the Trent, and entered the disputed borderlands between Mercia and Northumbria. Here, in territory that had changed hands multiple times over the previous decades, they encountered the first signs of Northumbrian resistance, burned settlements, blocked roads, and the occasional skirmish with scouting parties sent out to monitor their progress. As they pushed deeper into Northumbrian territory, Penda's forces began to encounter more serious opposition. Oswiu had not been idle during the months when his enemies were assembling their coalition. He had withdrawn his people and their livestock into fortified positions, creating a landscape that offered little in the way of supplies or easy targets for raiders. This scorched earth strategy, while brutal for the Northumbrian population, had the effect of stretching Penda's supply lines and forcing the coalition army to live off whatever provisions they could carry with them. The first major objective of Penda's campaign was the royal fortress of Bambur, Oswiu's principal stronghold and the symbolic heart of Northumbrian power. The fortress, perched on its rocky outcrop overlooking the North Sea, had been considered virtually impregnable for generations. Yet Penda's forces, displaying the engineering skills that had made Mercian warriors famous throughout Britain, managed to surround the stronghold and subject it to a systematic siege. For weeks, the coalition army maintained its blockade of Bambur, while engineers constructed siege engines and attempted to undermine the fortress walls. The sight of the great pagan army encamped beneath the Christian stronghold must have seemed deeply symbolic to observers on both sides, a final confrontation between the old gods and the new, between the traditional warrior culture of the Anglo-Saxons and the emerging Christian kingship that Oswiu represented. Yet despite their tactical successes, Penda's forces found themselves facing increasing difficulties as the campaign dragged on into the autumn months. The problem of supply became increasingly acute as local resources were exhausted, and the long supply lines back to Mercia came under attack from Northumbrian raiders. More serious still was the growing tension within the coalition itself, as Welsh, East Anglian, and Mercian commanders disagreed over strategy and priorities. It was during these difficult weeks that young Wulfhere received his first real education in the harsh realities of military leadership. He watched his father struggle to maintain unity among fractious allies, mediate disputes between prideful nobles, and make the difficult decisions that campaign leadership required. The experience taught him lessons about compromise, patience, and the careful management of competing interests that would prove invaluable during his own later reign. The crisis that would ultimately doom Penda's campaign began with a desperate diplomatic initiative by King Oswiu. Recognizing that his position was becoming increasingly untenable, the Northumbrian king sent messengers to Penda's camp, offering a substantial tribute in exchange for peace. The offer included not just gold and silver, but also hostages from the royal family, including Oswiu's own son Ecgfrith, then still a young boy. Penda's response to this overture revealed both his strengths and his limitations as a political leader. True to his warrior ethos, he rejected the offer of tribute, declaring that he was determined to destroy Oswiu's kingdom completely. "I will exterminate his people," he reportedly declared, "from the highest to the lowest." This uncompromising stance, while consistent with traditional notions of honor and revenge, eliminated any possibility of a negotiated settlement that might have preserved his army for future campaigns. Oswiu's reaction to this rejection was characteristic of his cunning and adaptability. Rather than awaiting destruction in his fortress, he chose to make one final gamble on the field of battle. Gathering whatever forces he could muster, including the garrison of Bamberg and contingents withdrawn from other strongholds, he marched out to meet Penda's coalition army at a place the chroniclers would later call the River Winwaed. The location of this fateful battlefield remains debated by historians to this day, though most scholarly opinion favours a site somewhere in the vicinity of modern Leeds, where several rivers converge in terrain that matches the descriptions provided by contemporary sources. What is certain is that the battle was fought on November 15th, 655, during a period of heavy autumn rains that had swollen the local streams and turned the countryside into a morass of mud and standing water. Young Wulfhere was not present for the battle itself. Following prudent military custom, Penda had sent his youngest son back to Mercia several days before the final confrontation, recognizing that the entire royal line should not be risked in a single engagement. This decision, painful though it must have been for both father and son, ultimately proved crucial to the survival of the Mercian dynasty and the eventual restoration of the kingdom's independence. The Battle of Winwaed began at dawn on a grey, drizzling morning that seemed to mirror the sombre mood of both armies. Contemporary accounts suggest that Oswu's forces numbered no more than 5,000 or 6,000 men, a substantial disadvantage compared to Penda's coalition, but one that was partially offset by their superior unity and the desperate courage that comes from fighting with one's back to the wall. The initial phases of the battle appeared to favour Penda's larger army. The Mercian warriors, fighting with the fury of men who had travelled far from home for this moment, broke through the Northumbrian front line in several places and seemed poised to achieve the decisive victory their king had promised. Welsh cavalry harassed the Northumbrian flanks, while East Anglian infantry pressed forward in the centre, their war cries echoing across the muddy battlefield. Yet the tide of battle began to turn when Penda's coalition started to suffer from the very diversity that had been its strength. Cadafel of Gwynedd, perhaps recognising that the battle was not developing as favourably as expected, withdrew his Welsh forces from the field without warning. This desertion, which earned him the contemptuous nickname Cadamed, or battle shirker, left a dangerous gap in the coalition's line. At the crucial moment when Northumbrian reserves were being committed to the fight, even more damaging was the behaviour of Ethelwald of Deira, whose supposed support for Penda had been one of the coalition's greatest diplomatic triumphs. Rather than engaging actively in the battle, Ethelwald positioned his forces on a hill overlooking the battlefield and waited to see which side would emerge victorious. This treacherous neutrality deprived Penda of forces he had counted on, while simultaneously providing Oswiu with intelligence about the coalition's movements and intentions. The collapse of Penda's army, when it came, was swift and catastrophic. Caught between the steadily advancing Northumbrians and the rising waters of the flooded river behind them, the coalition forces found themselves trapped in an increasingly desperate position. What had begun as an orderly fighting retreat quickly degenerated into a panic-stricken rout as warriors abandoned their weapons and attempted to flee across the treacherous waters. King Penda himself died as he had lived, sword in hand, fighting to the last against overwhelming odds. Contemporary accounts differ on the exact circumstances of his death, but all agree that he fell while attempting to rally his men for one final stand against the pursuing Northumbrians. His body was recovered from the battlefield and, according to Bede's account, his head was severed and displayed as a trophy of Oswiu's victory. The death toll at Winwaed was enormous by the standards of 7th century warfare. In addition to Penda himself, the battle claimed the life of King Ethelhere of East Anglia and 30 of his sub-kings and nobles. Contemporary sources report that more men drowned in the flooded river during the retreat than were killed by weapons during the actual fighting, suggesting the truly desperate nature of the coalition's final collapse. News of the disaster reached young Wulfhere at Tamworth several days later, brought by a handful of survivors who had managed to escape the carnage and make their way home through the hostile countryside. The 15-year-old prince received the news of his father's death with the stoic composure that his royal upbringing had taught him, but those close to him reported that he aged years in the space of a few hours As the full implications of Penda's defeat became clear, the immediate aftermath of Winwaed was chaotic throughout Mercia. With their king dead and their army destroyed, the Mercian nobles faced the prospect of complete subjugation by the victorious Northumbrians. Oswiu, true to the harsh realities of 7th century politics, moved quickly to consolidate his conquest before any organized resistance could develop. The northern portions of the Mercian kingdom were simply annexed outright, incorporated into Northumbria as conquered territory, and placed under direct royal administration. The southern regions received somewhat gentler treatment, being granted to Penda's son Peada as a subordinate kingdom. But even this apparent mercy came with conditions that made clear Mercia's complete dependence on Northumbrian goodwill. For young Wulfhere, the immediate danger was very real. As Penda's son and a potential focus for Mercian resistance, he represented a threat to Oswiu's newly established order that could not be safely ignored. Yet the same nobles who had witnessed his father's military genius recognized in the boy the seeds of future greatness, and they moved quickly to hide him from Northumbrian agents who were scouring the countryside for surviving members of the royal family. The 3 years that followed, from 655 to 658, would prove to be the most formative period of Wulfhere's life. Hidden away in remote settlements, moving constantly to avoid detection, the young prince experienced firsthand the sufferings of his people under foreign rule. He witnessed the humiliation of proud Mercian nobles forced to kneel before Northumbrian officials, the impoverishment of communities required to pay tribute to their conquerors, and the gradual erosion of traditional Mercian customs under pressure from their Christian overlords. These experiences taught Wulfhere lessons that no amount of formal education could have provided. He learned to distinguish between genuine loyalty and mere expedience, to recognize the signs of gathering resistance, and to understand the deep well of resentment that foreign domination creates in even the most docile populations. Most importantly, he began to develop the patient, calculating intelligence that would later characterize his approach to both diplomacy and warfare. The murder of his brother Peada at Easter 656 marked a turning point in Wulfhere's understanding of his situation. Peada had attempted to maintain some degree of Mercian independence while acknowledging Northumbrian overlordship, but his assassination, apparently carried out by his own wife with Oswiu's knowledge, if not active encouragement, demonstrated that no accommodation with the conquerors was possible. From that moment forward, Wulfhere began to think not just of survival, but of restoration. Working with the small group of loyal nobles who had helped conceal him, he started to develop the network of contacts and supporters that would eventually make possible the dramatic revolt of 658. The hidden prince was preparing to emerge from the shadows as a king. In the cold winter of 658, as snow blanketed the Mercian countryside and ice formed along the edges of streams and rivers, 3 brave nobles made a decision that would change the course of English history. In a secluded meeting place deep within the ancient forest of Cannock, Imin, Afer, and Edbert, men whose names history barely remembers but whose courage restored a kingdom, gathered to discuss the liberation of their homeland and the restoration of their rightful king. These 3 nobles had maintained their loyalty to the House of Penda through the darkest years of Northumbrian occupation. They had watched their kingdom carved up and distributed among foreign officials, witnessed their ancient customs dismissed as barbarous superstitions, and endured the constant humiliation of serving masters they despised. Yet, through all these trials, they had never lost sight of their ultimate goal, the return of legitimate Mercian rule under Penda's surviving son. Imin, the eldest of the 3 conspirators, had served as one of Penda's most trusted advisors during the great king's final years. A man of considerable wealth and influence, He controlled extensive lands in the northern reaches of the kingdom and commanded the loyalty of numerous lesser nobles who looked to him for leadership in these troubled times. His decision to support Wulfhere's cause brought with it not just his own considerable resources, but also the tacit backing of much of the Mercian nobility. Aoife, younger but equally determined, represented the interests of the central Mercian heartland around Tamworth itself. His family had held lands along the Trent Valley for generations, and their manor houses had served as way stations for the young prince during his years in hiding. Aoife's intimate knowledge of local conditions and his network of contacts among the common people made him invaluable for gathering intelligence about Northumbrian troop movements and administrative policies. Edbert, the third member of this crucial triumvirate, brought military expertise that would prove essential in the coming conflict. A veteran of many campaigns under Penda's leadership, he understood better than most the tactical challenges involved in confronting Northumbrian forces and the strategic opportunities that might arise from careful timing and coordination. His reputation among the younger generation of Mercian warriors made him a natural choice to serve as the revolt's military commander. The three conspirators had spent months carefully evaluating the political situation before committing themselves to active resistance. They had noted the growing signs of discontent throughout the occupied territories, the increasing burden of Northumbrian taxation, and the resentment generated by foreign officials who showed little understanding of local customs or concerns. More encouragingly, they had observed that Oswio's attention was increasingly focused on other frontiers, particularly his troubled relationship with the Pictish kingdoms to the north. Intelligence gathered through their network of contacts suggested that the Northumbrian king was preparing for a major campaign in Scotland, an undertaking that would require him to withdraw substantial forces from his southern territories. This potential reduction in Northumbrian military presence offered the best opportunity for successful resistance that had emerged since the disaster at Winwaed 3 years earlier. The conspirators also recognized that any successful revolt would require not just military coordination, but also careful attention to the symbolic and religious dimensions of legitimacy. The Mercian people needed to see their resistance not as mere banditry or political opportunism, but as the righteous restoration of their ancient royal line. This meant that Wulfhere himself would need to play a central role in the uprising, demonstrating to both supporters and enemies that the legitimate heir to Penda's throne had survived and was ready to reclaim his inheritance. Young Wulfhere, now 18 years old and fully mature despite his years of hardship, had grown considerably during his time in hiding. The frightened boy who had fled Tamworth in 655 had been transformed by adversity into a thoughtful, determined young man who combined his father's political instincts with a deeper understanding of human nature than Penda had ever possessed. His experiences among common people during his exile had given him insights into the needs and aspirations of his subjects that would later prove invaluable in governing a diverse and complex kingdom. The prince had also used his years of enforced leisure to educate himself in ways that would have been impossible during the normal routine of court life. He had learned to read Latin from sympathetic clerics, studied the histories and genealogies that legitimized royal authority, and absorbed the lessons of classical military strategy from whatever manuscripts he could obtain. This intellectual development, combined with his practical education in the realities of resistance and survival, prepared him for kingship in ways that conventional royal upbringing could never have achieved. As winter turned to spring in 658, the conspirators began to implement their carefully laid plans for revolt. Messages were sent through trusted intermediaries to noble families throughout Mercia, informing them of the intended uprising and requesting their support when the time came for action. Arms and armour, hidden since the defeat at Winwaed, were quietly redistributed to loyal warriors who had maintained their allegiance to the old royal house. The timing of the revolt was carefully coordinated with Oswu's departure for his Scottish campaign. Intelligence reports confirmed that substantial Northumbrian forces were being withdrawn from Mercian territory to support the king's northern adventure, leaving behind only skeleton garrisons in the major strongholds and administrative centres. This reduction in enemy strength provided the window of opportunity that the conspirators had been waiting for. The signal for the uprising came in early summer 658, transmitted through a network of beacon fires that had been prepared months in advance. From hilltop to hilltop across the Mercian countryside, flames leaped into the night sky, carrying the message that the hour of liberation had finally arrived. In response to this ancient call to arms, warriors emerged from forests and villages, throwing off the cloak of submission they had worn for 3 long years, and revealing themselves once again as free Mercians fighting for their homeland. The revolt's initial targets were carefully chosen to maximize both strategic advantage and symbolic impact, rather than attempting to storm the heavily fortified strongholds where Northumbrian governors had established their headquarters. The rebels focused on cutting communication lines, seizing supply depots, and isolating enemy garrisons from each other and from potential reinforcement from the north. Wulfhere himself emerged from hiding to take personal command of the main rebel force as it advanced on Tamworth. His appearance at the head of the army created an electric effect among both his own followers and the enemy forces they encountered. Here was visible proof that Penda's line had survived, that legitimate Mercian kingship endured despite 3 years of foreign occupation, and that the ancient royal house was ready to reclaim its rightful place. The young prince's first public appearance as rebel leader was carefully stage-managed to maximize its political impact. Dressed in armor that had belonged to his father and carrying the ancient sword that symbolized Mercian royal authority, he rode through the countryside on a magnificent war horse, accepting the acclamation of crowds that gathered to witness his return. The sight of their rightful king, alive and at the head of a growing army, inspired thousands of previously neutral Mercians to join the rebellion. The psychological effect of Wulfhere's reappearance extended far beyond his own supporters. Northumbrian officials throughout Mercia suddenly found themselves governing a hostile population that no longer feared to express its true feelings. Garrison commanders, who had grown comfortable during 3 years of peaceful occupation, discovered that their positions were isolated and vulnerable, surrounded by enemies who knew every path and stream in the surrounding countryside. The military aspects of the revolt proceeded with remarkable efficiency, demonstrating the careful preparation that had preceded the uprising. Local Northumbrian garrisons, cut off from communication with their superiors and facing overwhelming numbers of highly motivated enemies, found themselves with little choice but to surrender or flee. Within a matter of weeks, virtually all of Mercia below the Trent had been cleared of Northumbrian presence. The administrative aspects of the restoration proved equally successful. Rather than simply destroying the governmental structures established during the occupation, Wulfhere chose to adapt and modify them to serve Mercian interests. Northumbrian officials were replaced by loyal Mercians, but many of the bureaucratic innovations introduced during the previous 3 years were retained and improved upon. This pragmatic approach demonstrated the young king's understanding that effective government required more than just traditional legitimacy. The speed and completeness of the Mercian restoration caught Oswiu completely off guard. Engaged in his Scottish campaign and confident in the security of his southern territories, the Northumbrian king found himself facing a strategic crisis that threatened to undermine his entire position. The loss of Mercia not only deprived him of valuable tribute and manpower, but also exposed his own kingdom to potential attack from a revived enemy. Oswu's initial response was to dispatch whatever forces he could spare from his Scottish campaign to attempt a reconquest of the lost territories. However, these hastily assembled expeditions proved inadequate to the task of subduing a kingdom in full revolt. The Mercian rebels, fighting on familiar ground with the support of the local population, were able to avoid decisive battles while inflicting steady casualties on the Northumbrian forces through ambush and harassment. More significantly, the Mercian revolt had a domino effect throughout the region, inspiring resistance movements in other kingdoms that had been forced to acknowledge Northumbrian overlordship. The success of Wulfhere's uprising demonstrated that Oswu's empire was not as secure as it had appeared, encouraging other subject peoples to test the limits of their overlord's power. The young king's handling of the immediate aftermath of the revolt demonstrated political maturity that belied his years. Rather than seeking revenge against those who had collaborated with the Northumbrian occupation, he adopted a policy of reconciliation that emphasized unity and healing rather than retribution. This magnanimous approach helped to integrate former collaborators back into Mercian society, while demonstrating to neighboring kingdoms that his rule would be characterized by justice rather than vindictiveness. Wulfhere's first royal council, convened at Tamworth in the autumn of 658, brought together representatives from every corner of the restored kingdom. The sight of the great hall once again filled with Mercian nobles, conducting business in their own language according to their own customs, symbolized the completeness of the restoration that had been achieved. Yet the young king's opening address to this assembly demonstrated that he had learned important lessons from the years of exile and occupation. "My lords," he began, speaking in the clear, measured tones that would characterize his public pronouncements throughout his reign, "we gather here not merely as victors in a struggle against foreign domination, but as inheritors of a sacred trust. Our fathers and grandfathers built this kingdom through courage and wisdom, but they also left us lessons written in defeat as well as victory. We must build anew, but we must build better than before." This philosophical approach to kingship, emphasizing learning and adaptation rather than simple restoration of past practices, would become one of the hallmarks of Wulfhere's rule. He had observed during his years in hiding how rigid adherence to traditional methods could lead to catastrophic failure, and he was determined to avoid repeating his father's mistakes while preserving the essential strengths of Mercian culture and governance. The immediate challenges facing the newly restored kingdom were formidable. 3 years of foreign occupation had disrupted traditional patterns of trade and agriculture, while the tribute payments demanded by Northumbrian administrators had drained the royal treasury and impoverished many noble families. The military forces that had achieved the liberation were still essentially a rebel army, lacking the organization and equipment needed for sustained operations against professional opponents. Perhaps most seriously, the kingdom's international position remained precarious. While the revolt had succeeded in expelling Northumbrian forces from Mercian territory, it had not eliminated the fundamental threat posed by Oswu's continued hostility. The Northumbrian king still possessed substantial military resources, and his recent setbacks were likely to make him more rather than less determined to reassert his authority over his former subjects. Wulfhere addressed these challenges with characteristic energy and intelligence. His first priority was the reorganization of Mercian military forces, transforming the irregular bands that had fought in the revolt into a professional army capable of defending the kingdom's restored independence. Veterans of his father's campaigns were recalled to service and given responsibility for training younger warriors in the disciplines of organized warfare. The king also moved quickly to restore diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms, many of which had maintained a cautious neutrality during the revolt while waiting to see whether it would succeed. His approach to these negotiations demonstrated the same combination of firmness and flexibility that had characterized his domestic policies, making clear that Mercia was prepared to defend its interests while remaining open to mutually beneficial agreements. One of the most important early diplomatic initiatives was the restoration of the traditional alliance with the Welsh kingdoms that had been such a crucial element of his father's foreign policy. The Celtic rulers who had fought alongside Penda at Winwaed had their own reasons for opposing Northumbrian expansion, and they proved receptive to overtures from the restored Mercian kingdom. These renewed alliances provided Wulfhere with valuable allies on his western frontier, while creating additional security challenges for Oswiu. The young king also recognized the importance of economic recovery in consolidating his political gains. The years of occupation had disrupted traditional trade patterns and reduced agricultural productivity, leaving many of his subjects struggling to rebuild their livelihoods. Rather than simply demanding increased taxes to support his military needs, Wulfhere implemented policies designed to encourage economic growth and restore prosperity to his kingdom. These economic initiatives included the establishment of new markets and trading posts, the improvement of roads and waterways to facilitate commerce, and the negotiation of favorable trade agreements with merchant communities in neighboring kingdoms. The king's personal involvement in these seemingly mundane matters demonstrated his understanding that military victories meant little unless they were followed by policies that improved the lives of ordinary subjects. The restoration of religious life in Mercia presented particular challenges that would ultimately lead to one of the most significant developments of Wulfhere's early reign. During the years of occupation, Christian missionaries had continued their work throughout the kingdom, and many Mercians had converted to the new faith, despite their political resistance to Northumbrian rule. This created a complex situation in which religious and political loyalties did not necessarily coincide. Wulfhere's initial approach to this religious complexity reflected the same pragmatic tolerance that his father had displayed, but with an important difference. While Penda had remained personally committed to the old gods while tolerating Christian activity, his son began to show signs of genuine interest in the new faith. This interest was partly political. Christianity offered diplomatic and cultural connections with other kingdoms that pure paganism could not provide, but it also reflected a personal spiritual journey that would ultimately transform both the king and his kingdom. The winter of 658 to 659 marked the end of the immediate crisis period and the beginning of what historians would later recognize as one of the most successful reigns in early English history. The young king, who had emerged from hiding to lead a desperate revolt, had proven himself capable of the complex tasks of restoration and governance. Yet the greatest challenges and achievements of his reign still lay ahead, as he prepared to transform Mercia from a restored kingdom into the dominant power in southern England. As the snow melted and spring returned to the Mercian countryside in 659, Wulfhere could look with satisfaction on what had been accomplished in less than a year. The independence of his kingdom had been secured, its internal structures had been rebuilt and strengthened, and its international position had been stabilized through a combination of military success and diplomatic skill. The frightened exile of 655 had become a confident king whose authority was acknowledged throughout his realm. Yet even as he celebrated these early successes, Wulfhere was already planning the next phase of his reign. The restoration of Mercian independence had been only the first step in a larger vision that would ultimately see his kingdom dominate much of England through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic alliance, and religious transformation. The hidden prince had become a king, but his greatest achievement still lay ahead. Unlike his fierce pagan father, Wulfhere would embrace a faith that promised not just victory in battle, but eternal peace in heaven. The transformation of the young Mercian king From traditional believer in the old gods to committed Christian represents one of the most significant religious conversions in early English history, with consequences that extended far beyond personal faith to reshape the very nature of kingship and governance throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The question of when and how Wulfhere embraced Christianity remains one of the most intriguing mysteries of his reign. Unlike his brother Penda, whose conversion had been a public affair undertaken primarily for political reasons to secure a marriage alliance with Northumbria, Wulfhere's spiritual journey appears to have been a more gradual and personal process that unfolded over several years during his youth and early kingship. The seeds of his eventual conversion may have been planted during his years in hiding, when the young prince found himself dependent on the kindness of ordinary Mercian families, many of whom had quietly embraced the Christian faith, despite their political resistance to Northumbrian rule. In the humble cottages and modest manor houses where he sought refuge, Wulfhere would have observed firsthand how Christian beliefs could coexist with traditional Mercian values, providing comfort and hope to people facing seemingly impossible circumstances. These early encounters with practical Christianity differed markedly from the formal, politically motivated religious displays he had witnessed at his father's court. Here was a faith that spoke directly to human suffering and uncertainty, offering the promise of divine protection and eternal reward to those who remained faithful in the face of adversity. For a young man who had experienced the collapse of everything he had been taught to believe secure and permanent, such promises carried profound emotional appeal. The influence of his brother Peada's earlier conversion should not be underestimated in understanding Wulfhere's spiritual development. Despite the political circumstances that had initially motivated Peada's embrace of Christianity, his younger brother had observed that the new faith seemed to bring genuine peace and purposefulness to the elder prince's life. Even after Peada's tragic murder in 656, stories circulated about his final months as a Christian king, suggesting that his faith had provided him with a courage and serenity that transcended mere political calculation. Perhaps even more significant was the influence of the Christian mission that Peada had established in Mercia during his brief reign. Led by priests from Northumbria and Ireland, these missionaries had continued their work even during the darkest years of occupation, ministering to converts and gradually building a network of Christian communities throughout the kingdom. Their persistence in the face of political upheaval demonstrated a commitment that impressed even those who remained loyal to traditional beliefs. The gradual nature of Wulfhere's conversion becomes evident when examining his actions during the early months of his restored reign. While he permitted Christian worship and even showed favour to Christian priests, he also maintained many traditional pagan practices and continued to participate in seasonal festivals honouring the old gods. This religious duality reflected both political caution and genuine spiritual uncertainty. As the young king struggled to reconcile his inherited beliefs with new possibilities, the turning point in Wulfhere's spiritual journey appears to have come during the winter of 659 to 660, when a severe outbreak of disease swept through the Mercian countryside, claiming hundreds of lives and threatening the stability of the recently restored kingdom. Contemporary accounts suggest that the king was deeply affected by his inability to protect his subjects from this invisible enemy, leading him to question whether traditional religious responses were adequate to meet such challenges. It was during this crisis that Wulfhere appears to have experienced what can only be described as a spiritual revelation. According to later Christian chroniclers, the king spent several nights in prayer and meditation, seeking guidance from both the old gods and the Christian deity about how best to serve his suffering people. The answer, when it came, convinced him that his kingdom's future lay with the new faith, rather than the traditional beliefs of his ancestors. The king's formal conversion to Christianity took place in a private ceremony conducted by Bishop Jaruman, one of the missionaries who had continued their work during the years of occupation. Unlike the public spectacles that often accompanied royal conversions in other kingdoms, Wulfhere chose to embrace his new faith in a simple, intimate setting that emphasized personal commitment over political theatre. The symbolism of this private conversion was profound. By choosing to become Christian without fanfare or diplomatic necessity, Wulfhere demonstrated that his embrace of the new faith was genuine rather than expedient. This authenticity would prove crucial in convincing his subjects that their king's religious transformation represented a sincere spiritual journey rather than mere political calculation. The immediate effects of the king's conversion were felt throughout Mercian society. Nobles who had been uncertain about the religious implications of the restoration now saw clear guidance from their monarch about the spiritual direction of the kingdom. Many who had been quietly sympathetic to Christian teachings felt free to openly embrace the new faith, while others who remained committed to traditional beliefs recognized that accommodation rather than resistance would best serve their interests. Wulfhere's approach to implementing Christian practices in his kingdom demonstrated the same careful balance between innovation and tradition that characterized his political policies. Rather than attempting to suppress pagan practices immediately and completely, he chose to gradually replace them with Christian alternatives that preserved much of their ceremonial and social function while redirecting their spiritual content. The seasonal festivals that had marked the rhythm of Mercian life for centuries continued to be celebrated, but they were gradually transformed into Christian observances that honored saints rather than pagan deities. The great winter celebration that had traditionally honored Woden became a Christmas festival celebrating the birth of Christ, while spring fertility rituals were redirected toward prayers for divine blessing on crops and livestock. This gradual transformation of religious practice required considerable skill and sensitivity from the king and his Christian advisors. They needed to preserve enough traditional elements to avoid alienating conservative nobles, while introducing sufficient Christian content to satisfy newly converted believers. The success of this delicate balancing act can be measured by the relative absence of religious conflict during Wulfhere's reign, in marked contrast to the violent disputes that characterized religious change in many other kingdoms. The king's marriage to Eormenhild of Kent, which took place sometime during the early 660s, provided both personal happiness and additional religious validation for his Christian commitment. Eormenhild, daughter of the deeply pious King Eormenhild, brought with her not only valuable political connections, but also a sophisticated understanding of Christian theology and practice that complemented and deepened her husband's own faith. The royal couple's devotion to Christianity became legendary throughout their kingdom and beyond. They were known to begin each day with private prayers, to maintain regular fasts during the appropriate liturgical seasons, and to show extraordinary generosity to the poor and unfortunate. Their court became a center of Christian learning and missionary activity, attracting religious scholars from throughout Europe and serving as a model for other rulers considering conversion. The construction of churches and monasteries accelerated dramatically under Wulfhere's Christian kingship. The king personally funded the establishment of numerous religious houses throughout his territories, providing them with generous endowments of land and treasure that enabled them to become centers of education and spiritual life. The most famous of these foundations was the great monastery at Medeshamstede, later known as Peterborough, which became one of the most important religious and cultural centers in early medieval England. These monastic foundations served multiple purposes in Wulfhere's broader strategy for kingdom building. They provided centers for Christian education that gradually created a literate administrative class. capable of supporting more sophisticated governmental functions. They served as focal points for community life in areas where traditional tribal structures had been disrupted by war and political change. Most importantly, they demonstrated the king's commitment to Christian values in ways that could be seen and experienced by ordinary subjects throughout the realm. The missionary activities sponsored by Wulfhere extended far beyond the borders of Mercia itself. The king provided financial support and military protection for Christian priests, working to convert the pagan populations of neighbouring kingdoms, particularly in East Anglia and Sussex. This religious diplomacy served both spiritual and political purposes, creating networks of shared faith that facilitated military alliances and commercial relationships. The conversion of the South Saxons provides an excellent example of how Wulfhere combined religious and political objectives in his foreign policy. When King Ethelwald of Sussex expressed interest in Christianity, the Mercian king not only provided priests to instruct him in the new faith, but also served as his godfather at the baptism ceremony. This spiritual relationship created bonds of mutual obligation that proved valuable in subsequent diplomatic and military initiatives. The king's support for Christian missionary work also extended to regions that remained under nominal Northumbrian control. By providing covert assistance to priests working in these areas, Wulfhere was able to build networks of sympathy and support that would prove valuable if military confrontation with Oswu's successors became necessary. This religious penetration of enemy territory represented a form of warfare by other means that complemented traditional military and diplomatic strategies. The theological sophistication of Wulfhere's Christian commitment becomes evident when examining his relationship with prominent religious figures of his time. His friendship with Bishop Wilfrid of York, one of the most learned and influential churchmen of the period, involved extensive theological discussions that revealed the king's genuine interest in doctrinal matters rather than mere ceremonial observance. These conversations, recorded in Stephen of Ripon's Life of Wilfrid, show a ruler deeply concerned with understanding the intellectual foundations of his adopted faith. Wulfhere asked probing questions about the relationship between divine providence and royal responsibility, the proper balance between mercy and justice in governance, and the spiritual obligations that Christian kingship imposed on those who wielded temporal power. The king's theological interests also extended to questions of ecclesiastical organization and authority. He played an important role in the complex negotiations that led to the appointment of Chad as Bishop of Mercia in 669, demonstrating his understanding that effective Christian governance required proper coordination between secular and religious authorities. His support for Chad's establishment of the episcopal see at Lichfield created one of the most important ecclesiastical centres in medieval England. The personal relationship between King Wulfhere and Bishop Chad represents one of the most remarkable partnerships in early Christian England. Despite their different backgrounds and temperaments, the king a warrior politician, the bishop a humble monk, they developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to Christian principles. Their collaboration would profoundly influence both the political development of Mercia and the spiritual character of English Christianity. The transformation of Wulfhere from pagan prince to Christian king was completed not through dramatic conversion, but through years of gradual spiritual growth and deepening commitment. By the mid-660s, contemporary observers noted that the king's Christian faith had become the organizing principle of his life, influencing every aspect of his personal conduct and public policy. This authentic religious transformation would provide the foundation for the most successful and influential phase of his reign. By the early 660s, Wulfhere had transformed from a fugitive prince into the most powerful king south of the Humber River, wielding an authority that his father Penda could never have imagined possible. The decade that followed would witness the systematic expansion of Mercian influence across southern England, achieved not primarily through devastating conquest, but through a sophisticated combination of military pressure, diplomatic alliance, and religious solidarity that created a new model for Anglo-Saxon kingship. The strategic foundation for this expansion lay in Wulfhere's clear understanding of the political geography that had emerged in England following the catastrophe at Winwaed. The old patterns of tribal warfare and personal vendetta that had characterized his father's generation were giving way to more complex relationships based on overlordship, tribute, and mutual defense agreements. Rather than attempting to rule conquered territories directly, the new Mercian king developed a system that allowed subordinate rulers to maintain local authority while acknowledging his superior position. This approach proved particularly effective because it addressed one of the fundamental weaknesses that had led to Penda's downfall. The great pagan king had created enemies faster than he could defeat them, ultimately facing a coalition that included nearly every significant power in Britain. Wulfhere, by contrast, sought to transform potential enemies into dependent allies, creating a network of relationships that strengthened rather than weakened Mercia's position with each new acquisition. The first major test of this new approach came with Wulfhere's campaign against the West Saxon kingdom of Wessex, which had been gradually expanding its influence northward into territories that Mercia considered within its natural sphere of interest. Rather than launching an all-out war of conquest, the Mercian king chose to demonstrate his power through a series of calculated raids that inflicted maximum psychological impact while minimizing the risk of costly battles. The famous raid on Ashdown in 661, recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle with the simple notation that Wulfhere harried as far as Ashdown, represented far more than a simple plundering expedition. By penetrating deep into West Saxon territory and striking at one of their most important royal centres, the Mercian king demonstrated that he possessed both the military capability and the political will to project power far beyond his own borders. The psychological effect of this demonstration was immediate and profound. West Saxon nobles who had been considering resistance to Mercian expansion suddenly found themselves forced to recalculate the costs and benefits of opposing such a formidable opponent. King Wulfhere of Wessex, faced with the prospect of defending his kingdom against an enemy who could strike anywhere at will, chose negotiation over continued confrontation. The terms of the subsequent agreement between Mercia and Wessex established the pattern that Wulfhere would follow throughout his expansion southward. Rather than demanding the complete submission of the West Saxon kingdom, he negotiated arrangements that gave him control over specific territories and trade routes, while allowing Wulfhere to maintain his royal dignity and most of his ancestral domains. This face-saving compromise made acceptance easier for the West Saxon king, while achieving most of Mercia's strategic objectives. The most spectacular success of this southern campaign was Wulfhere's conquest of the Isle of Wight and the surrounding Meon Valley, territories that had been contested between various kingdoms for generations. The island's strategic position controlling access to the Solent made it valuable far beyond its modest size, while its capture demonstrated Mercian power in the most dramatic possible way. Yet even this military triumph was handled with characteristic diplomatic sophistication. Rather than incorporating the Isle of Wight directly into Mercia, Wulfhere chose to present it as a gift to King Ethelwil of Sussex, who had recently converted to Christianity under Mercian sponsorship. This generous gesture served multiple purposes. It rewarded a valuable ally, demonstrated Mercian magnanimity, and created a precedent for other kingdoms considering submission to Mercian overlordship. The conquest also provided an opportunity for one of the most significant missionary initiatives of Wulfhere's reign. The inhabitants of the Isle of Wight had remained stubbornly pagan, despite the conversion of most surrounding territories, presenting both a spiritual challenge and a political problem for a Christian king seeking to expand his influence. The king's solution was to sponsor a comprehensive evangelization effort that combined gentle persuasion with practical incentives for conversion. The priest Eopa, sent to the island with Wulfhere's blessing and financial support, established the first Christian communities there and began the gradual process of replacing pagan practices with Christian alternatives. The success of this mission, which resulted in the peaceful conversion of the entire island population within a few years, provided a model for similar initiatives in other newly acquired territories. The expansion of Mercian influence into Surrey and Essex followed similar patterns, with local rulers accepting Wulfhere's overlordship in exchange for protection against external enemies and internal rivals. The key to these arrangements was the king's willingness to work through existing power structures rather than attempting to replace them entirely. Sub-kings like Frithioald in Surrey maintained their traditional authority while acknowledging Mercian supremacy in matters of foreign policy and military service. These overlordship arrangements were cemented by marriage alliances that created lasting bonds between the Mercian royal house and the ruling families of subordinate kingdoms. The marriage of Frithioald to Wulfhere's sister Wilbur exemplified this diplomatic strategy, creating personal relationships that transcended mere political convenience and established emotional ties that would endure through changing circumstances. Perhaps most crucial to Mercian expansion was Wulfhere's control of London, the most important commercial centre in southern England. The city's position at the hub of river and road networks made it essential for anyone seeking to dominate trade throughout the region, while its wealth provided resources that could fund further military and diplomatic initiatives. Rather than ruling London directly, Wulfhere established arrangements with local merchants and administrators that protected Mercian interests while allowing the city's commercial life to flourish. This hands-off approach proved highly successful, as London's prosperity increased dramatically during the period of Mercian overlordship, generating tribute payments that helped fund the king's various initiatives while creating goodwill among the merchant classes. The economic benefits of Mercian expansion extended far beyond tribute payments and commercial profits. The creation of a large zone of internal peace and stability encouraged trade and agricultural development throughout the region, leading to increased prosperity that benefited all levels of society. Villages that had lived in constant fear of raiders could invest in permanent improvements, while merchants could plan longer trading expeditions without excessive concern about political disruptions. This economic growth had important military implications as well. Prosperous subjects could afford better weapons and armor, while stable communities could support larger populations of potential warriors. The tribute payments from subordinate kingdoms provided resources for maintaining professional military forces, while the growth of trade generated customs revenues that reduced the burden of taxation on Mercian subjects. The diplomatic aspects of Wulfhere's expansion were equally sophisticated. Rather than simply demanding submission from neighbouring rulers, he offered them membership in what amounted to a defensive alliance that provided security benefits in exchange for acknowledgement of Mercian leadership. This approach proved particularly appealing to smaller kingdoms that faced threats from multiple directions and lacked the resources to defend themselves independently. The arrangement with Kent provides an excellent example of this diplomatic complexity. King Eormenhild of Kent was too powerful and well-connected to be coerced into submission, but he was also intelligent enough to recognize the benefits of Mercian friendship. The marriage alliance between Wulfhere and Eormenhild's daughter Eormenhild created bonds that served both kingdoms' interests, while avoiding the costs and uncertainties of military confrontation. This Kentish alliance proved particularly valuable because of Kent's extensive connections with the Frankish kingdoms across the English Channel. Through his Kentish relatives, Wulfhere gained access to continental European political networks and trading relationships that enhanced Mercia's international position. The king's court began to attract visitors and envoys from across Europe, establishing his kingdom as a major player in international diplomacy. The religious dimensions of Mercian expansion were equally important to its long-term success. As a Christian king ruling over an increasingly Christian population, Wulfhere could appeal to shared religious values in ways that his pagan predecessors had never been able to match. The common faith created bonds of sympathy and solidarity that transcended traditional tribal boundaries and provided a foundation for lasting political unity. The king's support for missionary activities in newly acquired territories served both spiritual and political purposes. Christian priests, supported by Mercian resources and protected by Mercian authority, established churches and monasteries that became centers of community life and cultural development. These religious institutions created lasting ties between local populations and the Mercian crown, while their educational activities produced literate administrators who could serve in the expanding royal bureaucracy. The monastery foundations sponsored by Wulfhere during this period represented massive investments in the kingdom's future development. The great house at Medeshamstede, endowed with vast estates and magnificent treasures, became one of the premier centres of learning in Northern Europe. Its scriptorium produced manuscript copies of religious and secular works that preserved ancient knowledge and disseminated new ideas, while its school trained generations of clergy and administrators who would serve throughout the expanded Mercian territories. The king's personal involvement in these religious foundations went far beyond mere financial support. Contemporary accounts describe his regular visits to monastic communities, his participation in religious ceremonies, and his close relationships with prominent spiritual figures. This visible demonstration of Christian devotion enhanced his reputation among newly converted populations, while providing moral authority that complemented his temporal power. By the end of the 660s, the extent of Mercian influence had reached proportions that would have seemed impossible at the time of Wulfhere's accession. From the Welsh borders in the west to the East Anglian fenlands, from the Humber River in the north to the English Channel in the south, a vast network of allied and subordinate kingdoms acknowledged Mercian leadership in varying degrees. This remarkable achievement had been accomplished with relatively little bloodshed, demonstrating the effectiveness of Wulfhere's diplomatic and political skills. Unlike his father's conquests, which had created resentment and resistance that ultimately contributed to Penda's downfall, the younger king's expansion created genuine loyalty and enthusiasm among many of his new subjects. The administrative challenges posed by ruling such an extensive and diverse territory required innovative solutions that would influence English governmental development for centuries to come. Wulfhere developed systems of communication, taxation, and military organization that allowed effective central control while preserving local autonomy. His court became a training ground for the administrative and diplomatic skills that would be essential to the future development of English kingship. As the decade of the 660s drew to a close, King Wulfhere of Mercia stood at the pinnacle of his power and influence. The hidden prince who had emerged from exile barely 10 years earlier now commanded resources and wielded authority that made him the most powerful ruler in Britain, south of the Scottish borders. Yet this golden age of expansion and prosperity would soon face its greatest test, as the king prepared to challenge the one remaining power that disputed his claims to supremacy over all of England. In 669, a humble monk from Northumbria arrived at Wulfhere's court, destined to become one of his closest advisors and dearest friends. Chad, later canonized as Saint Chad of Lichfield, brought with him a simple holiness and profound wisdom. that would complement the king's political acumen and military prowess, creating one of the most remarkable partnerships between temporal and spiritual authority in early medieval Europe. The story of their first meeting has been preserved in the writings of the Venerable Bede, who gathered his information from those who had witnessed the encounter personally. Chad arrived at Tamworth during the depths of winter, travelling on foot despite his episcopal dignity and the harsh weather conditions that had made the roads nearly impassable. His modest appearance and humble demeanour initially puzzled the royal guards, who found it difficult to believe that this simple man in worn religious robes could be the distinguished bishop whom Archbishop Theodore had appointed to serve the Mercian church. King Wulfhere, informed of the visitor's arrival, received Chad in the great hall with all the ceremony appropriate to his ecclesiastical rank. Yet it quickly became apparent that this was no ordinary diplomatic encounter between secular and religious authority. The bishop's evident holiness and complete lack of personal ambition made an immediate impression on the king, who had grown accustomed to dealing with clergy who seemed more interested in temporal advancement than spiritual guidance. Chad's background made him an ideal choice to serve as bishop in a kingdom undergoing religious transformation. Born into a noble Northumbrian family, he had received his early education at the great monastery of Lindisfarne, under the guidance of St. Aidan. His formation in the Celtic Christian tradition, with its emphasis on personal holiness and missionary zeal, had prepared him well for the challenges of converting pagan populations and establishing Christian institutions in previously unreached territories. The new bishop's appointment to Mercia had come about through the intervention of Archbishop Theodore of Tarsus, the Greek scholar whom Pope Vitellian had sent to England to reorganize and strengthen the Anglo-Saxon Church. Theodore, recognizing that the success of Christianity in Mercia would depend largely on finding the right man to lead the evangelization effort, had carefully considered the candidates available before settling on Chad as the ideal choice for this crucial position. The challenge facing Chad was enormous. While Wulfhere's conversion had provided official support for Christian activities, the vast majority of his subjects remained either pagan or only superficially Christian. The bishop would need to establish ecclesiastical structures, train native clergy, build churches and monasteries, and gradually replace centuries of pagan tradition with Christian alternatives, all while maintaining the delicate balance between innovation and respect for existing customs that had characterized the king's policies. The partnership between king and bishop began with practical discussions about where to establish the episcopal see that would serve as the center of Christian administration for the kingdom. Several locations were considered, including Tamworth itself and the ancient Roman settlement of Lettersetum, but Chad's preference for Lichfield ultimately prevailed. The site, located on Watling Street, about 7 miles northwest of the royal capital, offered several advantages. It was easily accessible to travellers from all parts of the kingdom. It had historical significance as a place where early Christian martyrs had suffered persecution, and it provided sufficient space for the cathedral, monastic buildings, and administrative facilities that would be required. Wulfhere's generous grant of land for the new cathedral complex demonstrated his commitment to supporting Chad's mission in the most practical possible way. The king provided not just the site itself, but also extensive surrounding territories whose revenues would support the bishop and his growing staff of clergy. This royal endowment, carefully documented in charters that survive to this day, established Lichfield as one of the wealthiest episcopal sees in Anglo-Saxon England. The construction of the cathedral at Lichfield became a joint project that symbolized the cooperation between secular and spiritual authority that would characterize the relationship between Wulfhere and Chad throughout their partnership. The king provided materials and labor, while the bishop contributed architectural knowledge an artistic vision drawn from his extensive travels and study of Christian buildings in other kingdoms. The resulting structure, while modest by later medieval standards, represented a significant achievement for its time and place. Built of local stone with timber supports and decorative elements, the cathedral incorporated both Roman architectural traditions and Germanic craftsmanship, creating a uniquely Anglo-Saxon style that would influence church building throughout the region. The interior decorations, including carved stone crosses and painted wooden panels, combined Christian symbolism with traditional Mercian artistic motifs. Chad's personal lifestyle provided a constant example of Christian virtue that impressed both the king and his subjects. The bishop lived in deliberate simplicity, maintaining only the minimum possessions necessary for his ecclesiastical duties, and giving away most of the revenues from his extensive lands to support the poor and fund missionary activities. His habit of travelling on foot throughout his diocese, regardless of weather conditions or personal discomfort, became legendary among the people he served. The spiritual relationship between Wulfhere and Chad developed gradually through their regular conversations about the practical and theological challenges of governing a Christian kingdom. The king sought the bishop's guidance on matters ranging from the proper conduct of diplomatic negotiations to the spiritual implications of military campaigns. These discussions, often extending late into the night, revealed Chad's profound understanding of how Christian principles could be applied to the complex realities of temporal power. One of the most significant early collaborations between king and bishop involved the establishment of monastic communities throughout the Mercian territories. Chad brought with him from Northumbria a deep appreciation for the role that monasteries could play in preserving Christian learning, providing spiritual guidance, and serving as centres of community life in rural areas. Wulfhere, recognizing the political as well as religious benefits of such institutions, provided generous support for their foundation and endowment. The monastery established at Barrow upon Humber provides an excellent example of how these partnerships functioned in practice. Chad identified the site as strategically located for missionary work among the still pagan populations of Lincolnshire, while Wulfhere recognized its commercial potential as a trading post that could generate revenues for both secular and religious purposes. The king's grant of land and initial funding was complemented by the bishop's provision of trained monks and accumulated manuscripts that made the new foundation immediately viable. The success of these monastic foundations exceeded everyone's expectations. Within a few years, the monasteries established under Chad's guidance had become centres of agricultural innovation, technological development, and cultural preservation that benefited their surrounding communities in ways that went far beyond their original religious purposes. Their schools trained not only future clergy, but also the literate administrators that Wulfhere's expanding kingdom increasingly required. The missionary activities sponsored jointly by king and bishop extended far beyond the borders of Mercia itself. Chad's network of contacts in Northumbria, Ireland, and continental Europe provided access to experienced missionaries and valuable manuscripts, while Wulfhere's political influence opened doors in kingdoms where purely religious approaches might have met with suspicion or resistance. The conversion of the East Saxons provides a particularly clear example of how this partnership operated in practice. When the kingdom suffered a relapse into paganism following the departure of earlier missionaries, Chad proposed a comprehensive evangelization effort that would address both spiritual and practical concerns. Wulfhere provided military protection for the missionaries, economic incentives for conversion, and diplomatic pressure on reluctant nobles, while Chad supplied the theological expertise and spiritual authority necessary to make the conversions genuine and lasting. The personal friendship between king and bishop deepened through their shared participation in the great liturgical celebrations that marked the Christian calendar. Christmas and Easter became occasions for magnificent ceremonies that demonstrated the kingdom's Christian identity while providing opportunities for both spiritual reflection and political symbolism. These celebrations, attended by nobles from throughout the Mercian territories and visiting dignitaries from neighbouring kingdoms, showcased the successful integration of Christian faith with traditional royal authority. Chad's influence on Wulfhere's personal spiritual development was profound and lasting. The bishop served as the king's confessor and spiritual director, providing guidance not only on matters of religious doctrine, but also on the ethical dimensions of political decision-making. Their regular private conversations, often conducted during long walks through the countryside around Lichfield, covered topics ranging from the proper treatment of prisoners of war to the spiritual obligations of wealth and power. The king's growing reputation for personal holiness, noted by contemporary chroniclers, reflected Chad's influence on his character and conduct. Wulfhere became known for his accessibility to common petitioners, his generous support for the poor and disadvantaged, and his scrupulous honesty in all his dealings. These qualities, while partly natural to his temperament, were deliberately cultivated through the spiritual disciplines that Chad taught him. The bishop's own reputation for miracles and supernatural interventions added an additional dimension to their partnership that enhanced both men's authority among their subjects. Stories of Chad's healing powers, his prophetic visions, and his ability to call down divine blessings on those who sought his help created an aura of sanctity around the episcopal see at Lichfield that reflected favourably on the king who had made its establishment possible. One of the most famous stories from this period involves the legendary conversion of two young Mercian nobles while hunting in the forest near Lichfield. According to the tale, preserved in various medieval chronicles, the brothers Wulfhere and Ruffin encountered Chad while he was praying in a forest clearing and were so impressed by the evident holiness they witnessed that they immediately requested baptism. The story, whether historically accurate or legendary, illustrates the powerful impact that Chad's example had on the Mercian nobility and the role that personal witness played in the kingdom's ongoing conversion. The partnership between Wulfhere and Chad also produced innovations in ecclesiastical organisation that would influence English church development for centuries to come. The bishop's establishment of a network of rural churches and chapels, supported by royal endowments and served by trained priests, created a pastoral system that brought Christian teaching and sacraments within reach of ordinary subjects throughout the kingdom. These rural churches served multiple functions beyond their purely religious purposes. They became centres for elementary education, legal arbitration, and community assistance that helped to integrate scattered populations into the larger structures of royal government. The priests who served them often acted as informal agents of royal authority, reporting on local conditions and helping to implement royal policies at the village level. The intellectual collaboration between king and bishop resulted in significant developments in Christian scholarship and manuscript production. Chad brought with him from Northumbria a substantial library of religious texts, while Wulfhere provided the resources necessary to establish a major scriptorium at Lichfield. The manuscripts produced there, combining Irish, continental and Anglo-Saxon traditions, represented some of the finest achievements of early medieval book production. The king's personal interest in these scholarly activities went beyond mere patronage. Contemporary sources describe his regular participation in discussions of theological questions, his careful attention to the accuracy of manuscript copying, and his involvement in decisions about which texts should be translated into the vernacular for use among less educated clergy. This intellectual engagement reflected both Chad's influence and Wulfhere's natural curiosity about the faith he had adopted. The missionary expeditions sponsored jointly by king and bishop achieved remarkable success in converting previously pagan populations throughout the expanded Mercian territories. The combination of royal protection, material support, and Chad's spiritual authority proved irresistible to many who had remained uncommitted to either the old or new faiths. These conversions, achieved through persuasion rather than coercion, created genuine religious communities that would remain loyal to both Christianity and Mercia for generations to come. The death of Saint Chad in March 672 marked the end of one of the most productive partnerships in early English history. The bishop, who had never enjoyed robust health, succumbed to what appears to have been a fever during one of his missionary journeys in Lincolnshire. News of his death reached Wulfhere at Tamworth, where the king was conducting the spring session of his royal council. Contemporary accounts describe the profound grief that Chad's death caused throughout the kingdom. The king, who had lost not only a valued advisor but also a genuine friend, reportedly spent several days in private mourning before emerging to organize the elaborate funeral ceremonies that befitted a man of Chad's stature and accomplishments. The bishop's body was brought back to Lichfield, where he was buried in the cathedral he had built, and his tomb quickly became a place of pilgrimage for Christians throughout England. The legacy of the partnership between Wulfhere and Chad extended far beyond their personal relationship. Together, they had created a model for Christian kingship that balanced temporal authority with spiritual responsibility, demonstrating how secular and religious leaders could work together for the benefit of their people. The institutions they established, churches, monasteries, schools, and administrative systems, provided the foundation for Mercia's continued prosperity and influence long after both men had passed from the scene. The influence of Chad's teaching and example continued to shape Wulfhere's policies and personal conduct throughout the remaining years of his reign. The king's reputation for justice, mercy, and genuine concern for his subjects reflected the spiritual formation he had received from his episcopal friend and advisor. Even as he faced the military and political challenges that would mark his final years, Wulfhere never lost sight of the Christian principles that Chad had helped him understand and embrace. Wulfhere understood that true power came not just from the strength of one's sword, but from the wisdom to know when to use diplomacy instead of force. Throughout the golden years of his reign, the Mercian king demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of international relations that enabled him to achieve through negotiation and alliance building what his predecessors had attempted through conquest alone. His court at Tamworth became the diplomatic centre of southern England, where envoys from distant kingdoms came to seek alliances, settle disputes, and participate in the complex web of relationships that bound together the emerging English nation. The foundation of Wulfhere's diplomatic success lay in his recognition that the old patterns of tribal warfare and personal vendetta that had characterized his father's generation were no longer adequate to the challenges of governing in an increasingly complex political environment. The rise of Christianity had created new forms of legitimacy and authority, while expanding trade networks had made economic considerations as important as military ones in determining the relationships between kingdoms. This new understanding manifested itself most clearly in the king's approach to marriage alliances, which he elevated from simple political arrangements to sophisticated instruments of long-term strategy. Rather than using royal marriages merely to seal temporary agreements or secure short-term advantages, Wulfhere recognized their potential for creating lasting bonds between kingdoms that could endure through changing circumstances and provide stability in an otherwise turbulent world. His own marriage to Eormenhild of Kent exemplified this strategic approach to royal matrimony. The alliance with King Eormenhild's family brought Mercia into contact with one of the most sophisticated and culturally advanced kingdoms in Anglo-Saxon England. Kent's long history of Roman influence, its extensive trade connections with continental Europe, and its central role in the introduction of Christianity to Britain, made it an ideal partner for a king seeking to modernize his own realm while maintaining its essential character. The negotiations leading to this marriage were conducted with extraordinary care and attention to detail, reflecting both kingdoms' understanding of the significance of the proposed alliance. Envoys travelled back and forth between Tamworth and Canterbury for months, working out not only the immediate terms of the marriage agreement, but also the broader framework of cooperation that would govern future relations between the two kingdoms. The wedding ceremony itself, conducted in 664 at Canterbury Cathedral with Archbishop Deusdedit presiding, was a magnificent display of both kingdoms' wealth and commitment to their new partnership. The guest list included nobles from throughout southern England, many of whom were seeing for the first time the splendour and sophistication that could be achieved when traditional Anglo-Saxon culture was enhanced by Christian learning and Roman administrative techniques. The political benefits of the Kentish alliance became apparent almost immediately. Kent's extensive trade networks provided Mercian merchants with access to continental markets, while its diplomatic connections helped to establish Wulfhere's reputation among Frankish and other European rulers. The cultural exchange facilitated by the marriage brought new ideas about art, architecture and governance that enriched Mercian civilization and enhanced the kingdom's prestige throughout the known world. Perhaps most importantly, the alliance with Kent provided Wulfhere with a model for the type of collaborative relationship he sought to establish with other kingdoms throughout his sphere of influence. Rather than demanding submission and tribute, he offered partnership and mutual benefit, creating arrangements that served all parties' interests while acknowledging Mercian leadership in matters of common concern. The network of marriage alliances that Wulfhere established extended far beyond his own union with Eormenhild. His sister Wilbur's marriage to Frithiold of Surrey created strong ties with that strategically important kingdom, while other family connections bound Mercia to noble houses throughout the region. The king's possible brother Merriwal married into the Kentish royal family as well, wedding Eormenbur, and thereby creating multiple bonds between the two kingdoms. These family connections served as the foundation for a diplomatic system that relied heavily on personal relationships and mutual trust. In an age when written agreements were often ignored and formal treaties frequently violated, the bonds created by marriage and kinship provided a more reliable basis for long-term cooperation. Disputes that might have led to warfare between unrelated kingdoms could often be resolved through family mediation and compromise. The royal court at Tamworth during this period functioned as much more than a simple administrative centre. It served as a diplomatic hub where representatives from throughout the Anglo-Saxon world gathered to conduct business, exchange information, and participate in the elaborate ceremonial life that demonstrated Mercia's wealth and sophistication. The king's reputation for hospitality and fair dealing attracted visitors from kingdoms that had previously maintained only hostile relations with Mercia. These diplomatic gatherings followed carefully orchestrated protocols that balanced traditional Anglo-Saxon customs with newer practices derived from Christian and continental sources. The great feast that marked important occasions provided opportunities for informal discussion and relationship building, while formal audiences allowed for the conduct of official business according to established ceremonial procedures. The king's personal participation in these events, displaying both his learning and his respect for his guests, helped to create an atmosphere of mutual respect that facilitated successful negotiations. The economic dimensions of Wulfhere's diplomacy were equally sophisticated. Rather than relying solely on tribute payments and military intimidation, he developed trading relationships that provided mutual benefits, while creating economic dependencies that supported his political objectives. Mercian control of key trade routes, particularly through London and other commercial centres, gave the kingdom significant leverage in negotiations with trading partners. The king's approach to commercial diplomacy demonstrated his understanding that economic prosperity could be more effective than military conquest in achieving long-term political goals. By creating conditions that encouraged trade and investment, he made Mercian overlordship attractive to merchants and craftsmen throughout the region, building constituencies of support that transcended traditional tribal and regional loyalties. The administration of justice provided another avenue for diplomatic influence that Wulfhere exploited with considerable skill. His court's reputation for fair and efficient legal procedures attracted litigants from other kingdoms, particularly in cases involving complex commercial disputes or conflicts between nobles from different territories. The king's willingness to hear such cases and his reputation for impartial judgment enhanced Mercia's prestige while creating practical obligations among those who benefited from Mercian justice. The seasonal royal progresses that carried Wulfhere and his court throughout the expanded territories served multiple diplomatic purposes beyond their immediate administrative functions. These ceremonial journeys provided opportunities for the king to meet personally with local nobles, assess regional conditions, and demonstrate royal authority in areas where Mercian control might otherwise seem distant or theoretical. The elaborate ceremonial that accompanied these progresses was carefully designed to impress local populations while respecting their traditional customs and sensibilities. The king travelled with sufficient magnificence to demonstrate his power and wealth, but he also made himself accessible to ordinary subjects and showed appropriate respect for local shrines and customs. This balance between display and humility helped to build genuine loyalty among newly acquired populations. Religious festivals and ceremonial occasions provided additional opportunities for diplomatic activity that Wulfhere used with increasing frequency and sophistication as his reign progressed. Christmas and Easter celebrations at Tamworth became major international events that attracted visitors from throughout Europe, creating opportunities for informal diplomacy and relationship building that would have been impossible through formal negotiations alone. The king's personal involvement in religious ceremonies enhanced his reputation among Christian rulers while demonstrating his commitment to the faith he had adopted. His participation in monastic foundations, his generous donations to religious causes, and his evident personal piety created bonds of sympathy and respect with ecclesiastical leaders whose influence often exceeded that of secular rulers in matters of international diplomacy. The intelligence networks that supported Wulfhere's diplomatic initiatives were among the most sophisticated of their time. The king maintained regular correspondence with allies and potential partners throughout the known world, gathering information about political developments, economic opportunities, and potential threats that might affect Mercian interests. This intelligence system, built around a combination of official envoys, merchant contacts, and religious connections, provided the information base necessary for successful long-term planning. The training of diplomatic personnel represented another innovation that distinguished Wulfhere's court from those of his predecessors and contemporaries. Young nobles who showed aptitude for languages and negotiation were given formal instruction in diplomatic protocol, foreign customs, and negotiating techniques. This investment in human resources created a core of experienced diplomats who could represent Mercian interests effectively in the most challenging circumstances. The success of Wulfhere's diplomatic initiatives can be measured by the remarkable stability and prosperity that characterized his kingdom during the 660s and early 670s. Unlike the constant warfare that had marked earlier periods, these years saw sustained peace and growth that allowed for investment in infrastructure, culture, and long-term development projects. The king's ability to achieve his political objectives without resort to devastating military campaigns represented a fundamental advance in the art of statecraft. The integration of conquered or allied territories into the broader Mercian system required diplomatic skills of the highest order. Each kingdom or region brought its own traditions, grievances, and aspirations that needed to be accommodated within the larger framework of Mercian hegemony. Wulfhere's success in managing this diversity without destroying its essential character demonstrated a level of political sophistication that would not be matched again until the emergence of the great medieval monarchies centuries later. By the early 670s, the diplomatic system that Wulfhere had created encompassed virtually all of southern England and extended into Wales, Scotland, and continental Europe. The Mercian king had become the acknowledged leader of what amounted to a confederation of allied and subordinate kingdoms, bound together by ties of kinship, religion, economic interest, and mutual security. This remarkable achievement would provide the foundation for his final and most ambitious project, the direct challenge to Northumbrian supremacy that would test every aspect of his political and military skill. By 674, Wulfhere's power had grown so great that he began to dream of what his father had never achieved: dominion over all of England, including the proud kingdom of Northumbria that had humiliated Mercia nearly 20 years earlier. The time seemed ripe for such an ambitious undertaking. Oswiu, the conqueror of Penda, had died in 670, and his successor Ecgfrith appeared to face significant challenges that might make him vulnerable to a well-coordinated southern assault. The decision to challenge Northumbrian supremacy represented both the logical culmination of Wulfhere's previous successes and a fundamental departure from the cautious, diplomatic approach that had characterized most of his reign. For more than 15 years, the Mercian king had carefully avoided direct confrontation with the northern kingdom, while systematically building his power base in the south. Now, at the height of his influence, and with seemingly favorable conditions for success, he chose to attempt the final step that would make him overlord of all England. The strategic situation in 674 appeared to favour Mercian ambitions in several important respects. Ecgfrith, while an experienced warrior, lacked his father's diplomatic skills and had already demonstrated a tendency toward rash decisions that had cost him valuable allies. His harsh treatment of subordinate kingdoms had created resentment throughout his territories, while his aggressive policies toward the Celtic peoples of Scotland and Ireland had opened new fronts that divided his military resources. More encouragingly, from a Mercian perspective, several of Northumbria's traditional allies showed signs of wavering loyalty that might be exploited by a skillful enemy. The kingdom of Lindsey, which had changed hands multiple times over the previous decades, contained substantial populations that looked favourably on Mercian rule. Even within Northumbria itself, particularly in the southern regions that had once formed the independent kingdom of Deira, there were nobles who chafed under Ecgfrith's autocratic rule and might welcome liberation under Mercian leadership. The economic factors also seemed to favour Mercian success. Nearly 2 decades of peace and prosperity in the south had provided Wulfhere with financial resources far exceeding those available to any of his predecessors. The tribute payments from subordinate kingdoms, combined with revenues from expanding trade and agricultural development, had filled the royal treasury to levels that could support a major military campaign, without imposing crushing burdens on Mercian subjects. Perhaps most significantly, the religious transformation of Mercia had created new possibilities for building the kind of broad coalition that would be necessary for success against Northumbrian power. As a Christian king leading an increasingly Christian kingdom, Wulfhere could appeal to shared religious values and common opposition to pagan influences in ways that his father had never been able to achieve. The support of the church, both within Mercia and throughout southern England, provided moral authority that complemented military and political considerations. The planning for the northern campaign began in earnest during the winter of 673 to 674, as Wulfhere and his advisors carefully evaluated the strategic challenges they would face and the resources available to meet them. Unlike Penda's hastily assembled coalition of 655, this new effort would be built on years of careful preparation and systematic alliance building that reflected the lessons learned from previous failures. The military component of the campaign plan called for the assembly of the largest army in Mercian history, drawing not only on the kingdom's own substantial resources, but also on contingents provided by allied and subordinate rulers throughout the south. The Mercian heartland would provide the core of heavy infantry and cavalry, while allied kingdoms would contribute specialized forces that reflected their particular strengths and fighting traditions. The South Saxons, under their Christian king Ethelwald, promised substantial infantry forces experienced in fighting in the difficult terrain of the South Downs and the Weald. The East Saxons, despite their recent return to Christianity, after a period of pagan backsliding, offered naval support that could threaten Northumbrian coastal settlements and supply lines. Even the Welsh kingdoms, traditionally suspicious of Anglo-Saxon ambitions, showed interest in joining a coalition directed against their common Northumbrian enemy. The diplomatic preparation for the campaign was equally thorough. Envoys were dispatched to courts throughout Europe, seeking support, or at least neutrality, from powers that might otherwise intervene on Northumbria's behalf. The Frankish kingdoms, with their own complex relationships with Anglo-Saxon England, were courted through both secular and ecclesiastical channels. Even more ambitiously, contacts were established with Celtic kingdoms in Ireland and Scotland that had their own grievances against Northumbrian expansion. The religious dimensions of the campaign planning reflected the profound changes that had occurred in Mercian society since the days of Penda's pagan wars. Rather than relying on sacrifices to Woden and Tiw for divine favour, Wulfhere and his army participated in elaborate Christian ceremonies designed to invoke God's blessing on their righteous cause. These religious observances served both spiritual and practical purposes, creating a sense of common purpose among the diverse forces that would participate in the campaign, while demonstrating to potential opponents the moral authority behind Mercian ambitions. The economic preparation for the North campaign was perhaps the most impressive aspect of Wulfhere's planning. The king had spent years accumulating the gold, silver, weapons and supplies that would be necessary to support a major military effort for an extended period. Supply depots were established along the anticipated line of march, while arrangements were made with merchants and craftsmen to provide ongoing logistical support throughout the campaign. As spring turned to summer in 674, the great army began to assemble at designated gathering points throughout the Mercian territories. Contemporary observers estimated the total force at nearly 30,000 warriors, a number that, if accurate, would have made it comparable in size to Penda's coalition at Winwaed, but far superior in organization, equipment, and unity of command. The sight of this mighty host must have been both inspiring and terrifying to those who witnessed it. Mercian warriors in their traditional mail shirts and iron helmets marched alongside South Saxon infantry, carrying the long spears that had made them famous throughout southern England. Welsh cavalry units, their horses decorated with colourful harness fittings, provided mobility and reconnaissance capabilities that had been crucial to many of Wulfhere's previous successes. The king himself, now in his mid-30s and at the height of his physical powers, presented a magnificent figure as he reviewed his assembled forces, dressed in armour that combined traditional Germanic craftsmanship with newer techniques learned from continental armourers. carrying weapons that symbolized both his royal authority and his Christian faith. He embodied the fusion of old and new that had characterized his entire reign. The religious ceremonies that preceded the army's departure reflected the profound transformation that Mercia had undergone during Wulfhere's reign. Where Penda had sacrificed horses to the war god and poured mead on ancient altars, his son participated in Christian services that sought divine blessing for what was portrayed as a righteous campaign to liberate fellow Christians from oppressive rule. These ceremonies, conducted by bishops and abbots from throughout the kingdom, created a sense of moral purpose that distinguished this campaign from the simple wars of conquest that had characterized earlier periods. The march north proceeded smoothly during the early summer months of 674, as the Great Coalition moved through friendly territory and encountered only minimal resistance from Northumbrian border forces. The careful logistical preparation showed its value as supply trains moved efficiently along predetermined routes, while advance parties secured river crossings and established temporary camps for the main force. Yet even as military preparations proceeded according to plan, intelligence reports began to suggest that the strategic situation might be more challenging than originally anticipated. Ecgfrith, despite his reputation for political ineptitude, had responded to news of Mercian military preparations with surprising energy and effectiveness. Rather than awaiting attack in his strongholds, the Northumbrian king had begun assembling his own coalition forces and making diplomatic overtures to potential allies who might assist in the defense of his kingdom. More troubling still were reports that Ecgfrith had managed to secure substantial military assistance from unexpected sources. The Pictish kingdoms, despite their own grievances against Northumbrian expansion, apparently preferred dealing with familiar enemies to facing the prospect of Mercian domination over all of Britain. Irish kingdoms, influenced by ecclesiastical politics that favoured Northumbrian connections, had also provided support that could prove crucial in the coming confrontation. The first serious military encounter of the campaign took place in the disputed borderlands between Mercia and Northumbria, where advance elements of both armies clashed near the ruins of an ancient Roman settlement. This preliminary skirmish, while inconclusive in itself, provided valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities and revealed that the Northumbrians had learned important lessons from their previous encounters with Mercian forces. Ecgfrith's army, while smaller than Wulfhere's coalition, appeared to be better organized and more cohesive than expected. The Northumbrian king had evidently spent considerable effort in training his forces for the type of large-scale battle that traditional Anglo-Saxon warfare rarely involved. His warriors displayed discipline and coordination that compared favorably with the best continental armies, suggesting that the coming confrontation would be far more challenging than many of Wulfhere's supporters had anticipated. The psychological impact of this realization began to affect the morale of the Mercian coalition in subtle but significant ways. Warriors who had joined the campaign expecting easy victory and substantial plunder began to understand that they faced a formidable enemy prepared to fight desperately for survival. The casual confidence that had characterized the army's early movements gave way to a more sober recognition of the risks involved in their ambitious undertaking. The main battle, when it finally came, took place at a location that has never been definitively identified by historians, but which appears to have been somewhere in the region between modern York and the Scottish borders. Contemporary accounts provide frustratingly little detail about the tactical development of the engagement, but they all agree on its outcome. Despite their numerical superiority and careful preparation, the Mercian forces suffered a decisive defeat that shattered their coalition and forced Wulfhere into ignominious retreat. The reasons for this unexpected reverse have been debated by historians for more than a millennium. But several factors appear to have contributed to the Mercian disaster. The coalition's very size may have worked against it, creating coordination problems that Ecgfrith's more compact force was able to exploit. The diverse nature of Wulfhere's army, while providing certain tactical advantages, also created communication difficulties and conflicting approaches to battlefield decision-making. More fundamentally, the Mercian king appears to have underestimated both his opponent's military capabilities and his own army's limitations in conducting operations far from friendly territory. The campaign had required his forces to operate in unfamiliar terrain against enemies who knew every path and stream, while extended supply lines made sustained operations increasingly difficult as the campaign progressed. The personal impact of this defeat on King Wulfhere was profound and lasting. For nearly 20 years, he had known almost uninterrupted success in his political and military endeavours, building his reputation on careful planning and calculated risk-taking that had consistently achieved desired objectives. The Northern Campaign represented his first major failure, and the psychological consequences of this reverse would influence the remaining months of his reign. The immediate aftermath of the defeat required all of Wulfhere's political skill to manage successfully. The retreat south was conducted in good order, but the king faced the challenging task of maintaining unity among coalition partners who had suffered casualties and gained nothing from their participation in the failed campaign. Some allied kingdoms, particularly those that had provided forces reluctantly, began to question their continued association with Mercian policies. More seriously, the defeat encouraged enemies throughout the region to test the limits of Mercian power in ways that had been unthinkable during the years of seemingly effortless expansion. Wessex, in particular, began to show signs of renewed independence and even aggression that would pose significant challenges during the final years of Wulfhere's reign. Yet despite the magnitude of this setback, the fundamental structures of Mercian hegemony proved resilient enough to survive the immediate crisis. The loyalty of core territories remained solid, while most allied kingdoms continued to honour their obligations despite their disappointment with the campaign's outcome. The king's reputation for personal courage and continued political skill helped to limit the damage from what could have been a catastrophic reversal. The Northern Campaign of 674, despite its failure to achieve its immediate objectives, demonstrated both the extent of Wulfhere's ambitions and the limitations that even the most successful ruler faced in the political environment of 7th century England. The defeat marked the beginning of the final phase of his reign, during which the aging king would face new challenges that would test all the wisdom and experience he had accumulated during nearly 2 decades of rule. The year 675 dawned cold and grey over Mercia, and those closest to King Wulfhere noticed that the great king seemed unusually weary as he conducted the business of governing his vast realm. The defeat in Northumbria the previous year had taken a toll that went beyond mere military setback. For the first time in his remarkable career, the king, who had seemed invincible in both diplomacy and war, showed signs of the mortality that awaits even the mightiest rulers. The early months of 675 brought a series of challenges that would have tested any monarch, but which seemed particularly burdensome to a king who had grown accustomed to success in all his undertakings. Reports arrived daily from the southern borders, where West Saxon forces under King Esquine had begun testing the limits of Mercian authority with increasing boldness. These probing attacks, while not yet constituting open warfare, suggested that Wessex was preparing to exploit what they perceived as Mercian weakness following the northern defeat. Queen Eormenhild, ever sensitive to her husband's moods and concerns, noticed subtle changes in his daily routine that suggested deeper troubles than mere political setbacks. The king, who had once bounded from his bed each morning eager to tackle the day's challenges, now rose slowly and often spent long minutes standing at his chamber window, gazing out at the countryside he had worked so hard to unite and protect. Their private conversations during these difficult months revealed the philosophical and spiritual dimensions of Wulfhere's struggle with the implications of his northern defeat. As a Christian king who had come to see his reign as divinely blessed, he found it difficult to understand why God had permitted his righteous coalition to suffer defeat at the hands of Ecgfrith's smaller force. The theological questions raised by this experience led to extended discussions with surviving religious advisors and long periods of private prayer and meditation. The practical challenges of governing continued to demand attention despite the king's personal struggles with doubt and disappointment. The harvest of 674 had been poor throughout much of the kingdom, creating food shortages that required careful management to prevent serious social unrest. The royal granaries, maintained as reserves against exactly such emergencies, were open to provide relief to the most affected regions, but the distribution of this aid required constant supervision to ensure fairness and prevent corruption. The economic consequences of the failed northern campaign also created ongoing difficulties that absorbed much of the king's attention. The costs of assembling and maintaining such a large army for an extended period had strained even Mercia's substantial resources, while the lack of plunder or tribute from the defeated campaign meant that these expenses could not be offset through traditional means. New taxes and special assessments became necessary, creating the kind of popular discontent that Wulfhere had worked throughout his reign to avoid. More challenging still were the diplomatic repercussions of the defeat, as allied and subordinate kingdoms began to recalculate their relationships with Mercian overlordship. While none dared to renounce their allegiances openly, subtle changes in behavior and attitude suggested that Wulfhere's authority was no longer regarded as unquestionable. Tribute payments arrived late, military service was provided reluctantly, and diplomatic communications took on a more formal, less deferential tone than had been customary during the golden years of expansion. The king's response to these challenges demonstrated both his continued political skill and the physical toll that years of intensive rulership had taken on his health. While he continued to conduct the routine business of government with his customary efficiency and attention to detail, close observers noted that he tired more easily than before and seemed to find less pleasure in the ceremonial aspects of kingship that had once energized him. The seasonal royal progress undertaken during the summer of 675 provided opportunities for Wulfhere to assess personally the condition of his kingdom and the loyalty of his subjects. These journeys, while maintaining the magnificent display appropriate to royal dignity, became occasions for more intimate contact with local populations than had been typical during the years of seemingly effortless expansion. In village after village, the king met personally with common subjects who approached him with petitions for justice, requests for assistance, or simply expressions of continued loyalty. These encounters, often conducted in the shade of ancient oak trees or in the humble halls of local manor houses, revealed the deep affection that ordinary Mercians felt for their Christian king. Despite the recent military setbacks, the stories told during these visits painted a picture of genuine accomplishment that transcended temporary political difficulties. Farmers spoke of improved roads and bridges that had facilitated commerce and communication. Merchants praised the stability and security that had allowed trade to flourish throughout the region. Craftsmen displayed works of art and technical innovation that had been made possible by the peace and prosperity of Mercian rule. Most moving of all were the testimonials from religious communities throughout the kingdom. Abbots and abbesses, many of whom had received their positions through Wulfhere's direct patronage, spoke eloquently of the transformation that Christian kingship had brought to their territories. Churches, that had been mere ruins during the pagan period had been rebuilt and beautified. Monasteries that had struggled to survive now flourished as centers of learning and spiritual life. The conversion of entire populations, achieved through patient missionary work rather than forcible coercion, represented a spiritual achievement that would endure long after political arrangements had changed. These encounters with his subjects provided Wulfhere with a perspective on his reign that helped to put the northern defeat into proper context. While the failure to achieve dominion over all of England represented a significant setback to his ultimate ambitions, the transformation of Mercia itself, from a war-torn kingdom into a prosperous Christian realm, constituted an achievement of historic proportions. The king's growing acceptance of his limitations was reflected in the changing nature of his policy initiatives during the final months of his reign. Rather than planning new campaigns of expansion or schemes for military revenge against Northumbria, he focused increasingly on consolidating and strengthening the achievements of the previous 17 years. Administrative reforms were implemented to improve governmental efficiency, while additional resources were devoted to educational and religious institutions that would serve future generations. The autumn of 675 brought the first clear signs of the illness that would ultimately claim Wulfhere's life. What began as occasional fatigue and loss of appetite gradually developed into more serious symptoms that alarmed both his physicians and his family. The king, with characteristic determination, continued to fulfill his official duties despite increasing physical discomfort, but those closest to him recognized that his strength was failing. The nature of Wulfhere's final illness remains unclear from the limited medical knowledge available to contemporary chroniclers. Modern historians have speculated about various possibilities, ranging from infectious diseases that were common in the medieval period, to the stress-related conditions that might affect a ruler facing the kind of challenges that had marked his final years. What is certain is that the king faced his approaching death with the Christian courage and dignity that had characterized his approach to all of life's challenges. Queen Eormenhild's devotion during her husband's final months provided one of the most touching elements of the story that medieval chroniclers preserved for posterity. Despite her own grief and the political uncertainties that his death would create, she maintained a cheerful demeanor in his presence, while ensuring that he received the best possible medical care and spiritual comfort. Her strength during this difficult period demonstrated the depth of their partnership and the genuine affection that had grown between them during more than a decade of marriage. The king's final conversations with his brother Ethelred, who would succeed him on the Mercian throne, revealed both his acceptance of approaching death and his continued concern for the kingdom's future welfare. Rather than dwelling on his own achievements or failures, Wulfhere focused on providing practical advice about the challenges his successor would face and the resources available to meet them. These discussions covered every aspect of royal responsibility, from military organization and diplomatic protocol to ecclesiastical policy and economic management. The dying king's detailed knowledge of personalities, relationships, and local conditions throughout the expanded Mercian territories provided his brother with invaluable guidance for maintaining the complex system of overlordship and alliance that had been built up over the previous 2 decades. The religious preparation for death that Wulfhere undertook during his final weeks reflected the depth of his Christian commitment and the sincerity of the faith he had embraced as a young man. Daily prayers with the court chaplains, regular confession of sins, and generous final donations to religious causes demonstrated a spiritual maturity that impressed even those who had worked closely with him throughout his reign. The king's death, when it came in late autumn 675, was peaceful and surrounded by family and faithful retainers who had served him throughout his remarkable reign. Contemporary accounts describe his final moments as serene and dignified, with the dying monarch offering words of comfort to those who wept at his bedside, rather than seeking consolation for his own approaching departure from this world. His last recorded words, preserved by court chroniclers who were present during his final hours, reflected both his Christian faith and his continued concern for his subjects' welfare. "I have tried to serve God and my people faithfully," he reportedly whispered to Queen Eormenhild as she held his hand. "May the Lord judge me mercifully and protect this kingdom that we have built together." These simple words, spoken with the humility that had always characterized his approach to the responsibilities of kingship, provided a fitting summary of a reign that had transformed not just Mercia, but the entire character of Anglo-Saxon England. The immediate aftermath of Wulfhere's death revealed both the depth of affection his subjects felt for their departed king and the strength of the institutional structures he had created during his 17 years of rule, rather than the succession disputes and political chaos that often followed royal deaths in this period. The transition to his brother Ethelred's rule proceeded smoothly and peacefully, demonstrating the stability that effective governance had brought to the kingdom. Queen Eormenhild's decision to withdraw from secular life and enter a monastery following her husband's death reflected both her personal grief and the spiritual values that had guided their partnership. Her retirement to the religious community at Ely, where she would eventually serve as abbess, symbolized the deep integration of Christian and royal authority that had been one of Wulfhere's greatest achievements. The funeral ceremonies that honored the dead king provided a final demonstration of the unity and prosperity that his reign had brought to Mercia. Nobles from throughout the kingdom gathered at Tamworth to pay their respects, while representatives from allied and subordinate kingdoms attended to show their continued respect for Mercian leadership. The elaborate religious services, conducted by bishops and abbots from monasteries that Wulfhere had founded or supported, celebrated not just an individual life, but the transformation of an entire civilization. The burial itself, conducted with all the ceremony appropriate to a great Christian king, took place in a location that has never been definitively identified by historians, but which was clearly chosen to reflect both royal dignity and religious devotion. The grave goods that accompanied Wulfhere's body to its final rest, while modest by the standards of earlier pagan burials, included symbols of both his temporal authority and his spiritual commitment. The news of the Mercian king's death spread rapidly throughout Europe, carried by the extensive networks of communication that his diplomatic initiatives had established. The reactions of foreign rulers and religious leaders to word of his passing revealed the international significance of his achievements and the respect that his policies had earned among his contemporaries. Pope Adeodatus, writing to the Mercian court to express condolences on the king's death, praised Wulfhere's role in advancing Christian civilization and specifically noted his support for missionary activities throughout pagan regions. This papal recognition of the king's religious contributions provided formal acknowledgement of his importance in the broader history of European Christianity. Similar expressions of sympathy and respect arrived from Frankish rulers, Irish kings, and even some Northumbrian nobles who had opposed his political ambitions while recognizing his personal virtues and the benefits that his rule had brought to ordinary people throughout his territories. These tributes from former enemies testified to the genuine accomplishments of his reign and the legacy he would leave for future generations. The economic consequences of Wulfhere's death were remarkably limited, demonstrating the solid foundation that his policies had provided for Mercian prosperity. Trade continued to flow along the routes he had established, while agricultural production remained stable thanks to the peace and security that his rule had maintained. The financial reserves accumulated during the golden years of expansion provided resources for his successor to meet immediate challenges without imposing new burdens on his subjects. More significantly, the administrative and legal structures that Wulfhere had developed proved capable of functioning effectively under new leadership, suggesting that his governmental innovations had created lasting improvements in the machinery of royal authority. The trained personnel who had served in his administration continued their work under Ethelred, providing continuity and expertise that eased the challenges of succession. The military implications of the royal death were more complex, as neighbouring kingdoms tested the resolve of the new Mercian leadership, while enemies sought opportunities to exploit what they hoped might be temporary weakness. Yet the essential strength of Mercian military organisation, built up over nearly 2 decades of careful development, proved adequate to meet these challenges without requiring fundamental changes in strategy or structure. The religious communities that had flourished under Wulfhere's patronage provided some of the most enduring testimonials to his character and achievements. The monasteries he had founded continued to serve as centres of learning and spiritual life for centuries after his death, while the network of churches and schools established during his reign remained active in serving local populations and preserving Christian culture. The manuscript collections assembled in these religious institutions preserved not only theological works and liturgical texts, but also historical chronicles and legal documents that provided future generations with detailed records of Wulfhere's reign and its accomplishments. These written sources, unique for their time in their scope and accuracy, ensure that the story of the first Christian king of all Mercia would not be lost to the uncertainties of oral tradition. The personal relationships that Wulfhere had cultivated throughout his reign continued to influence political developments long after his death. The network of marriage alliances, diplomatic partnerships, and personal friendships that he had built provided his successors with valuable resources for maintaining Mercian influence and authority. The trust and respect that his conduct had earned created a reservoir of goodwill that would benefit Mercia for generations to come. Perhaps most importantly, the model of Christian kingship that Wulfhere had developed through his own example provided a template for future rulers throughout Anglo-Saxon England. His demonstration that effective governance could combine traditional warrior virtues with Christian mercy and justice influenced royal policy and behaviour for centuries after his death, contributing to the gradual transformation of early medieval kingship into more humane and responsible forms of authority. The immediate grief felt throughout Mercia at news of their king's death gradually gave way to a more lasting appreciation of what his reign had accomplished. Stories of his wisdom, generosity, and devotion to his subjects became part of popular tradition, while his reputation for justice and religious devotion earned him recognition among the great Christian rulers of early medieval Europe. As winter settled over the Mercian landscape in the months following Wulfhere's death, his subjects could look around them and see everywhere the evidence of his transformative reign. Churches and monasteries that had not existed at his accession now served thriving Christian communities. Roads and bridges that had been built or improved during his rule continued to facilitate trade and communication. Laws and customs that he had established provided frameworks for justice and social order that would endure long after their creator had been laid to rest. The young man who had emerged from hiding in 658 as a desperate rebel leader had died in 675 as one of the most successful rulers in early English history. His transformation of Mercia from a defeated and occupied territory into the dominant power in southern England represented an achievement that few of his contemporaries could have imagined possible. Yet even more significant than his political and military successes was his role in demonstrating how traditional Anglo-Saxon kingship could be enhanced and enriched through embrace of Christian faith and values. Long after the last mourner had left Wulfhere's tomb, The changes he had brought to England continued to shape the destiny of the emerging nation. The transformation that he had accomplished during his 17-year reign extended far beyond the temporary expansion of Mercian territory or the accumulation of tribute from subordinate kingdoms. He had fundamentally altered the nature of kingship itself, creating new models of authority that would influence English governance for centuries to come. The most immediate and visible aspect of Wulfhere's legacy was the network of churches and monasteries that dotted the landscape throughout his former territories. These religious institutions, established with royal patronage and protected by royal authority, had become integral parts of community life in ways that extended far beyond their purely spiritual functions. They served as schools where both clergy and lay people learned to read and write, as hospitals where the sick and injured could receive care, and as centres of technological innovation where new agricultural and craft techniques were developed and disseminated. The monastery at Medeshamstede, later known as Peterborough Abbey, exemplified the transformative impact of these religious foundations. Built with Wulfhere's generous endowments and populated by monks drawn from the finest religious communities in Europe, it had become, within a few years of its establishment, one of the premier centres of learning in Northern Europe. Its scriptorium produced manuscript copies of classical and contemporary works that preserved ancient wisdom while advancing new knowledge, while its school trained generations of scholars who would carry Christian learning throughout England and beyond. The economic effects of these monastic foundations were equally significant. The careful agricultural management practiced by religious communities often made their lands more productive than secular estates, while their workshops developed improved techniques for manufacturing everything from fine metalwork to illuminated manuscripts. The wealth generated by these activities supported not only the religious communities themselves, but also the surrounding populations, who found employment in monastery-related activities. More subtly, but perhaps more importantly, these religious institutions had created new networks of communication and cultural exchange that transcended traditional tribal and regional boundaries. Monks and scholars travelled freely between monasteries, carrying letters, books, and ideas that created a shared intellectual culture throughout the areas that had been under Mercian influence. This cultural unity would prove more durable than political arrangements, and would contribute significantly to the eventual emergence of a unified English identity. The administrative innovations developed during Wulfhere's reign left equally lasting marks on English governmental development. The system of overlordship that he had perfected, based on negotiated agreements rather than simple military conquest, had demonstrated that large territories could be governed effectively without resort to the constant warfare that had characterized earlier periods. This model would be studied and adapted by subsequent rulers, contributing to the gradual emergence of more sophisticated forms of royal administration. The legal precedents established during Wulfhere's reign also influenced English jurisprudence for generations to come. His reputation for fair and impartial justice, combined with his willingness to hear cases from throughout his territories, regardless of the party's social status or regional origins, had created expectations about royal responsibility that would constrain and guide his successors. The principle that kings were obligated to provide justice to all their subjects, while not entirely new, had been given practical meaning through Wulfhere's personal example. Perhaps most significantly, Wulfhere's reign had demonstrated the compatibility between effective temporal governance and sincere Christian faith. Earlier Christian kings had often been regarded as weakened by their religious commitments, as if mercy and forgiveness were incompatible with the stern requirements of royal authority. Wulfhere's success in maintaining order and expanding his influence while adhering to Christian principles had proven that religious devotion could actually strengthen rather than weaken effective leadership. This demonstration of Christian kingship had profound implications for the future development of English monarchy. Subsequent rulers could point to Wulfhere's example as proof that Christian virtue and political effectiveness were not contradictory, but complementary aspects of proper royal authority. The integration of religious and secular responsibilities that he had achieved became the standard by which later kings would be measured and the goal toward which they would strive. The diplomatic innovations of Wulfhere's reign also created lasting changes in the conduct of relations between Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. His preference for negotiation over conquest, his use of marriage alliances to create long-term partnerships, and his respect for the legitimate interests of allied and subordinate rulers had established precedents that made purely predatory warfare increasingly difficult to justify or sustain. The network of personal relationships that Wulfhere had built through his diplomatic initiatives continued to influence political developments long after his death. Noble families throughout southern England maintained connections established during his reign, creating informal channels of communication and influence that supplemented formal diplomatic procedures. These personal ties often proved more durable than official treaties and provided mechanisms for resolving disputes without resort to warfare. The economic policies developed during Wulfhere's reign also left permanent marks on English commercial development. His support for trade, his protection of merchant activities, and his promotion of market towns had created commercial networks that continued to function and expand under his successors. The prosperity that these policies had generated provided resources that enabled continued investment in infrastructure, culture, and military capabilities. More broadly, Wulfhere's reign had established the principle that royal authority should be exercised for the benefit of subjects, rather than simply for the aggrandizement of rulers. His visible concern for the welfare of ordinary people, demonstrated through his accessibility to petitioners and his generous support for charitable activities, had created popular expectations about royal responsibility that would influence political development for centuries to come. The educational legacy of Wulfhere's reign was equally significant, though perhaps less immediately obvious than its political and economic effects. The schools established in connection with his monastic foundations had created the first systematic educational opportunities available to significant numbers of Anglo-Saxon subjects. These institutions trained not only future clergy, but also the administrators, craftsmen, and merchants, whose skills were essential to an increasingly complex society. The literacy rates that began to improve during Wulfhere's reign, while still limited to small percentages of the total population, represented a fundamental change in the character of Anglo-Saxon civilization. For the first time, substantial numbers of people could read and write, creating possibilities for more sophisticated record-keeping, legal procedures, and cultural development. The manuscripts produced during this period preserved not only religious texts, but also historical chronicles, legal codes, and literary works that provided the foundation for later English cultural achievements. The military innovations of Wulfhere's reign also influenced the future development of Anglo-Saxon warfare. His demonstration that large, well-organized armies could be assembled and maintained for extended periods had shown the possibilities available to rulers with sufficient resources and administrative skill. His integration of different fighting traditions and techniques had created more flexible and effective military forces than had been typical in earlier periods. Perhaps more importantly, Wulfhere's approach to military leadership had emphasized the importance of strategic thinking and careful planning over simple battlefield courage. His successes had been achieved through patient preparation, diplomatic coordination, and systematic exploitation of enemy weaknesses, rather than through dramatic personal heroics or overwhelming force. This intellectual approach to warfare would influence military thinking throughout the medieval period. The international reputation that Wulfhere's reign had established for England also had lasting consequences for the island's place in European affairs. His diplomatic contacts with Frankish kingdoms, Irish rulers, and papal authorities had demonstrated that Anglo-Saxon England could participate as an equal in the broader community of European Christian nations. This international recognition would prove valuable to his successors and would contribute to England's growing influence in European politics and culture. The religious transformation that Wulfhere had overseen in Mercia also had implications that extended far beyond his own kingdom's boundaries. The success of his policies in converting pagan populations while maintaining social stability had provided a model that was studied and copied throughout Europe. Missionary bishops and royal advisors from other kingdoms came to study Mercian methods, carrying these techniques back to their own territories, where they were adapted to local conditions. The personal example that Wulfhere had provided as a Christian ruler also continued to influence individual leaders long after his death. Stories of his wisdom, generosity, and devotion to his subjects became part of the broader European tradition of exemplary kingship, providing moral guidance and practical instruction for rulers facing similar challenges in their own territories. The constitutional precedents established during Wulfhere's reign also influenced the long-term development of English governmental institutions. His practice of consulting with nobles and ecclesiastical leaders before making major policy decisions had created expectations about royal accountability that would shape the relationship between English monarchs and their subjects for centuries to come. While the formal institutions of parliamentary government lay far in the future, the principles of consultation and consensus building that Wulfhere had employed would contribute to their eventual emergence. The cultural achievements of Wulfhere's reign, while perhaps less obvious than his political and military successes, also left lasting marks on English civilization. The artistic works produced in monasteries and workshops under his patronage had established new standards of craftsmanship and aesthetic achievement that influenced creative development throughout the Anglo-Saxon period. The manuscript illumination, metalwork, and architectural innovations of this period set precedents that would be remembered and emulated for generations. The integration of Germanic and Christian traditions that Wulfhere had achieved in his own person and policies also provided a model for the broader cultural synthesis that would characterize medieval English civilization. His demonstration that traditional Anglo-Saxon values could be preserved and enhanced rather than abandoned in the process of Christianization had reassured conservative elements while encouraging progressive adaptation to changing circumstances. As the immediate aftermath of Wulfhere's death gave way to longer-term historical perspective, the true magnitude of his achievements became increasingly apparent. Later chroniclers, writing with the benefit of hindsight, recognized that his reign had marked a crucial turning point in English history, the moment when the random violence and cultural fragmentation of the early Anglo-Saxon period had begun to give way to the more stable, sophisticated, and unified civilization that would characterize medieval England. The transformation that Wulfhere had accomplished was not merely political or military, but fundamentally cultural and spiritual. He had shown that it was possible to maintain the essential strengths of Germanic warrior culture while embracing the intellectual sophistication and moral authority that Christianity could provide. This synthesis would become the foundation of English medieval civilization and would influence the development of European culture more broadly. Modern historians, evaluating Wulfhere's reign with the benefit of even greater temporal distance, have recognized him as one of the crucial figures in the emergence of England as a unified nation and a major European power. His demonstration that effective central authority could be combined with respect for local traditions and legitimate interests provided a template for successful governance that would be employed by rulers throughout the medieval period. The memory of Wulfhere's reign also provided inspiration and guidance for later generations facing similar challenges of political transformation and cultural adaptation. During periods of crisis or uncertainty, English leaders would look back to his example as proof that seemingly impossible changes could be achieved through patience, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to just principles. In the final analysis, Wulfhere's greatest legacy was perhaps his demonstration that individual leaders, working with courage and vision within the constraints of their historical circumstances, could achieve transformations that would benefit not only their own subjects, but future generations throughout Europe and beyond. The Christian king who had emerged from hiding as a desperate rebel had died as one of the founders of English civilization, leaving behind a legacy that would endure long after the political arrangements of his own time had been forgotten. And so ends our peaceful journey through the remarkable life of Wulfhere of Mercia, the Christian king who brought unity to a fractured land. From the hidden prince cowering in forest hideouts to the mighty overlord receiving tribute from half of England, his story reminds us that even in the darkest times, faith, wisdom, and determination can transform not just a single life, but the destiny of nations. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine the gentle sounds that once filled his royal court, the scratch of monks copying manuscripts by candlelight, the soft conversations of diplomats from distant kingdoms discussing treaties of friendship, the evening prayers rising from newly built chapels across the countryside, and the contented murmur of a kingdom at peace under a wise and Christian king. Picture the rolling hills of 7th century Mercia, where church bells called faithful subjects to prayer, where children learned their letters in monastery schools, and where travellers could journey safely along well-maintained roads protected by just laws and royal authority. If Wulfhere's gentle story has touched your heart tonight, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Which moment from his reign surprised you the most? Was it his dramatic emergence from hiding to reclaim his father's throne, his friendship with the humble Saint Chad, or perhaps his transformation from pagan warrior to Christian peacemaker? Would you like to hear more stories from the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms? Or are there other medieval rulers whose tales intrigue you? Your gentle words of encouragement mean the world to our growing community of sleepy historians, and they help guide us toward the stories that will bring you the most peaceful rest. Don't forget to leave a like if this historical journey brought you comfort. It truly helps other weary souls discover these soothing tales of ages past. And if you've enjoyed traveling back to 7th century England tonight, consider subscribing to join our cozy circle of dreamers who find peace in the whispered stories of kings and queens, saints and scholars from centuries long gone. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and may your rest be as peaceful as the kingdom Wulfhere left behind, a land where church and crown worked hand in hand, where justice flowed like clear water from mountain springs, and where the gentle light of Christian learning illuminated minds hungry for wisdom. Until our next historical journey together, sleep well in the knowledge that even in our troubled times, there have always been leaders who chose compassion over conquest, who built rather than destroyed, and who left the world better than they found it. Rest peacefully tonight, knowing that somewhere in the misty realm between waking and sleep, the good King Wulfhere still watches over his beloved Mercia, and his legacy of wise and faithful kingship echoes through the centuries to bless us still.